Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. And comment, where are you watching from and the time you are watching this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. I think something ate my grandpa. When I was 8, my family spent a summer living in some town called Mayor's Income, British Columbia. It's just one of those blink and you miss it towns along Highway 16 that's little more than a gas station tucked into the mountains. It's not on many maps. We moved because that's where my grandpa lived and he was dying. End-stage Alzheimer's. I don't think that's how a doctor would put it, but that's what it was. My parents were not nurses. I'm still not sure where the nurse came from. But my parents just thought it was a good idea for my older sister and me to spend as much time with our grandpa as we could, while we could. It was a nice idea, but I wish they hadn't. Every time we came over, there was the same routine. Grandpa opened the door as much as the chain would let him. He'd look at us, he'd look at the pictures on the mantle, then he'd let us in. Every single time. I don't know how he trained himself to do that, but he did. There were pictures of everyone. Us, my parents, the nurse, the guy who delivered the groceries, and each one had a label with the name. In the summer, my sister and I went over every day for at least a bit. Maybe just lunch. Maybe all day. A few times we slept over. You ever been in a forest at night? There's some weird sounds. But every time we heard something weird, if Grandpa was still up, he'd say, "It's just a deer." Or, "It's just a forest cat." A couple of times, he said, "I don't know what that is." And once, "That shouldn't be out there." The house backed up to the forest. Just trees as far as you can see, covering rolling hills and mountains that looked like they went so high they just merged into the sky. Like you could walk up a mountain and go into a cloud or space. I really wanted to go play in the forest, but Grandpa said no. Well, okay. He didn't so much say no as about have a panic attack the time I brought it up, so I never mentioned it again. I asked my mom about it when we went home. She just looked sad and told us not to go into the woods. After a bit of prodding, you know how kids can be, she finally told us that Grandpa has always thought something was living in the woods. But Mom never figured out what was supposed to be there. Just something, I guess. So I lied to you a bit ago. See, sometimes Grandpa would open the door, see us, recognize who we were, open the chain, then check the pictures on the mantel. He did that a few times with the nurse too, and once when he ordered groceries. And this wasn't like he did things out of order. This was like he recognized who we were, then remembered he was supposed to check. He opened the door and said, "How are we, Katie and Ivan?" Then checked the mantel. He knew our names without looking on the mantel. But that should have been impossible. When we first started coming, he did not know what time it was or what day it was, and he kept trying to go to work. Thinking about it now, the part that messed me up the most was how often he would ask us where his parents were. "Katerina, где моя mama? Ivanka, где mi tata? Katerina, где моя mama?" Oh, sorry. I should mention Grandpa's parents were both Ukrainian refugees, and he didn't learn English until he was a teenager. A few times, when we first started coming, he would slip back into Ukrainian. I don't speak much of the language, but there's a few phrases I know, and Ivanko, "Where is my dad?" is one of them. But here's this man who kept forgetting that his mother died 40 years ago, but 3 months later started recognizing his grandchildren. Is that how Alzheimer's is supposed to work? One day he opens the door to the chain and it's different. Like I think he recognized us, but thought he wasn't supposed to. He looked back at the mantle, looked at us, looked at the mantle again, looked to us. Then he looked at the couch, and there was some fucking kid sitting there. The kid shook his head no, and Grandpa shut the door on us. Maybe it's because she's the older sibling, but my sister is the assertive one. I wanted to call our parents, but my sister insisted on waiting in the tree line on the side of the house so we could see both doors for that kid to leave. Not sure what she wanted to do after that, but I'll tell you this. My first memory is her punching me in the face hard enough to give me a bloody nose. The kid did end up leaving the house, but just to the backyard with Grandpa. My sister, like I said, is the assertive one, the leader, the one with a plan. If anyone is going to start a pyramid scheme, It's her. If anyone's gonna go bankrupt in one, it's me. So my sister grabs a stick and runs up to the front door with me lagging behind. She opens the door and uses the stick to undo the chain. The pictures were all missing. Well, not missing. The frames were there, but the pictures were all of that fucking kid. It didn't occur to me right away, but the pictures were all of the kid in the same outfit he was wearing that day, and all of the backgrounds were from in Grandpa's house. My sister had me be lookout while she used an ottoman to get a closer look at the pictures. What she told me is that the labels were just ripped off, and the original pictures were behind the ones of that kid. And behind the pictures laying face down was another picture in the same frame. And it was that kid in the house in a different outfit. And there was no label. Grandpa was pointing out the different flowers in the garden, cornflowers, Woloshka, he had so many. And that kid turned his head 180 degrees around like a goddamn owl and looked me right in the eyes. I screamed and think I was about to wet myself. My sister and I bolted, but not before we saw the inside of that kid's mouth. Rows and rows and rows of teeth straight back to his throat, like a shark or something. We were supposed to be home for dinner, so we just waited in the tree line for our parents to pick us up. My sister and I never went back. We tried to explain what happened, sort of, but our parents didn't believe us. But we were so freaked out that they thought something had to have happened. They tried to get a hold of the nurse, but couldn't. Our parents ended up deciding that visiting Grandpa was too much for us, so they never had us go back. My mom got her brother to come up and take over watching Grandpa. He lived in the area anyways. Grandpa was dead a month later. My uncle said Grandpa's health declined fast. He almost immediately went back to not knowing people's names or recognizing people and started speaking only in Ukrainian. He had a doctor's appointment and my uncle was supposed to drive him, but somehow got the new nurse to do it. He was supposed to get an MRI, but he got confused and scared. The hospital called my uncle, but he insisted he could not go because he had work. The hospital got him into the MRI somehow, but he had a heart attack and died. My sister says it was out of spite. I'm not sure she's wrong considering some things I know about how Grandpa raised my mom. That kid wasn't at Grandpa's funeral. We didn't find the pictures of the kid when we cleared out his house. Grandpa looked rusted. That's how my mom put it. Rusted. Corroded. Like something corrupted, what was left of him. I'm not sure if that's how I'd put it, but there was something wrong with him. Something makeup couldn't cover, and I bet that fucking kid is responsible. There's a reason I decided to post this. My mom owns the house in Mayor's Income, BC. My parents decided they wanted to sell it, so my mom went up over the summer to assess the situation and start getting it ready. She called me 3 times one day to tell me the same story about meeting a nice young man my age. 3 times. Because she kept forgetting she already told me. Dad talked her into going to a doctor after she got lost going to a hardware store and ended up driving into a creek. She has Alzheimer's. But as the darkness deepened, this was only the beginning. Another nightmare waited just beyond the shadows. Wait before starting another story. Please subscribe our channel for more stories in future. I think my uncle murdered his daughter. I think my uncle murdered his daughter. Nobody bats an eye when the old get sick. It's the way of the world after all. You're born, slowly grow old, and you die. Sure, people will mourn. A few people may even weep at your funeral. And if you're lucky, someone will lay an occasional flower on your headstone. But when the young die, that's a completely different story. My little cousin Olivia was only 6 years old when she fell down the stairs of her 2-story house. The fall had snapped her neck somewhere along those 15 fateful steps. It was her mother who had found her tiny body. I could only imagine the horror she felt when her eyes met the sight of little Olivia's neck at a 90-degree angle. The thought made my spine shiver. My Aunt Lizzie now sobbed uncontrollably as we sat in the little chapel, Olivia's casket open for the few people who knew her in life to come and say goodbye. If Olivia had died an old woman, the chapel might be overflowing, but in 6 short years, she had not made many connections in her brief life. While many relatives were present, only a handful had come to know Olivia as well as I had come to know her. I had been her designated babysitter for many years. Her little lungs drew breath. so my heart shattered when I got the news. My Uncle Jesse spoke for his daughter in our hour of suffering. Olivia was a cheerful, energetic, and playful little kid. Her enthusiasm for life brought joy to anyone in her vicinity. Life can be cruel, unjust, and inhumane, but it is not our place to judge the work of the man upstairs. When it's your time, when he calls you up, when God needs you back, we can only heed the call. Olivia was too precious for this world. I believe our Heavenly Father knew that. That is why I can smile knowing that my little girl is in a better place. I don't know how he could be so calm and composed while talking about his recently departed daughter. She wasn't my daughter, and even my voice cracked whenever I spoke her name. He must have had a heart of stone, I thought to myself. Who am I to judge how someone mourned the passing of their little girl? After all, we are all different. Those who wish to say one last goodbye to Olivia, please do so now. The casket will be closed in a few short minutes. The funeral director informed. The rustling of a few people standing sounded over my Aunt Lizzie's sobbing. I didn't want to go up and see Olivia's body in that state, but my aunt clutched my arm and pulled me with her for moral support. How could I refuse? The line leading up to the casket began to thin, and soon we were faced with little Olivia's peacefully sleeping face. She wore a pristine white dress that seemed to blend with the casket's padding. Her satin black hair created a deep contrast with the casket's insides. Her skin looked cold and glazed over. Aunt Lizzie's head dropped onto Olivia as she gave her little girl one last worldly embrace. Why, Lord, why? Tears streamed down onto Olivia's dress, darkening some of the areas where they soaked into the fabric. I comforted my aunt and could not help but shed my tears as well, the memories of little Olivia replaying in my mind. Olivia! Oh, Olivia! My aunt cried. I looked down at Olivia's sleeping face, never expecting her to react to her mother's calls. Olivia. My Olivia. As the last A of her name left her mother's mouth, her eyes snapped open, thrusting my heart into the pit of my stomach. My eyes instantly dried up in my terror. Then Olivia's pupils trained their gaze on me. I wanted nothing more than to scream, but as I opened my mouth, the sound never managed to bypass the lump in my throat. I let my Aunt Lizzie go, taking a step backward in the process. Just then, I knocked into someone. My head shot around to see my Uncle Jesse looking at his daughter's face, unfazed by her soulless stare. He then looked at me with an expressionless face and gave me a smile of pity, before returning to his daughter's facade. I shot back around to look at Olivia, but was once again met with her peacefully sleeping expression. What the fuck? I thought to myself. Olivia was just... I must have imagined it. It must have been my imagination. What other explanation could there be? My uncle's cold hand snaked across my shoulders in an attempt to comfort me, and it did, before he whispered in my ear. It will be our little secret. You will tell no one of this. For the rest of the funeral, I was in a state of constant shock, trying to make sense of the situation, but never could. It had been a week since Olivia had died. They had pumped her body full of embalming fluid, and I'd even read over the coroner's report, a complete evisceration of the C1 and C2 vertebrae resulting in a complete severance of the spinal cord, pronounced dead at the scene. There was no way Olivia could still be alive. Absolutely no way. Those words played in my head as the first few pails of earth began to blanket her coffin. But my resolve was constantly questioned by Uncle Jesse's 1,000-mile stare from across the freshly dug hole. There is no way Olivia is still alive. My Aunt Lizzie continued in her emotional state long after Olivia had died. It's not hard to imagine, given that Olivia was an only child. Auntie Lizzie and Uncle Jesse's lives revolved around my little cousin. I tried my best to stay away. It was hard for me to hear her shrieking cries. As much as I loved Aunt Lizzie, there is only so much sadness a person can take. I'd preferred to push little Olivia as far out of my mind as I could. Well, there was that, but also Uncle Jesse's comment on the day of the funeral. I'd tried to dismiss it as it being a part of my imagination, but no matter how hard I tried, his words were as clear as that day they tickled my ear. It will be our little secret. That fear, however, would have to be put on the back burner, because Aunt Lizzie had called me over to help get rid of some of Olivia's things. Looking at them had brought too much grief to her heart, and she was having a hard time boxing them up. so it was up to me to lend a helping hand. I walked into their house, the same house where I'd babysat Olivia so many times. Everywhere I looked, memories of that little girl flooded back into my mind. Then my eyes met the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't help but imagine her little body sprawled out on the hardwood floor. A door creaked open, and I jolted in my uneasiness. It was Aunt Lizzie stepping out of the master bedroom, situated on the first floor. Her eyes were puffy, she'd been crying, and she attempted to compose herself before, greeting me with a warm smile. Our conversation was brief. She'd only given me instructions on what to box up. To my surprise, her instructions were to get rid of everything but Olivia's twin bed. She disappeared into her bedroom, and I thought I heard her faintly sobbing through the door. I trained my eyes on the top of the stairs, precariously stepping around where I'd imagined Olivia drew her last breath. There was a sense of apprehension as I reached the second floor, and I swore the air was colder as my foot graced the last step, but I pushed it out of my mind as I plunged myself into the task at hand. There was a lot to box up. About an hour into my work, I saw my breath condense in front of my face. The air temperature had plunged drastically. I felt my skin pimple and goose flesh, not because of the cold, but because a familiar figure graced the edge of my eye. Standing in the corner was a little girl wearing a white dress, Olivia. Her skin was no longer the same color as the day the casket's lid fell on her restful face. It was pale, icy, and cold. The mortician had done a fantastic job of styling her hair, but it now draped over much of her face in an unkempt way. She lifted her head, but before it could reach its full extension, it slumped over with a loud crack. Likewise, her cervical spine now pointed to the ceiling as it poked through the skin on her neck. Her head may have been resting on her shoulder, but her eyes looked at me with the same intensity as the day I swore I saw her open them while she lay in that tiny little box. I fell onto her bed, cowering backward until the drywall caressed my rear. Our eyes jousted there for what felt like hours. In reality, it was only seconds. Little Olivia raised a jagged finger, pointing to her nightstand beside her bed. I was too fearful to let go of my knees that were pressed up against my chest. But Olivia did not waver. She stood there steadfast, her eyes planted on me, her finger gesturing at the nightstand. I wasn't going to be let go until I investigated whatever she needed me to see. I cautiously unfurled myself out of my beetle position and crawled my way over to the first drawer, pulling it out while making sure Olivia wasn't going to jump on me. Inside were many of Olivia's crayon drawings. Many were family portraits, and some I'd even helped draw myself on the many nights I babysat. But as I flipped through the pieces, they became less wholesome and more strange. He was a stick figure of a little girl crying, a pair of eyes peering at the girl through the door. A drawing of a man, evident in the stick figure touting a beard, covered in blood. I'm pretty sure it was my Uncle Jesse, and a picture that made my heart sink, the little stick figure drawn girl crying in a corner as a mommy and daddy fought. I looked over at Olivia, but her finger had not been lowered. I flipped the page one more time and was met by a drawing of Uncle Jesse caressing a little girl with her head flopped over to the side, the mommy stick figure off to the side weeping. I looked back over at my little cousin as her finger finally lowered. "Did Uncle Jesse do this to you?" I questioned, but she made no gestures. I returned my eyes to the drawing. It must have been. I thought to myself, that would explain why Uncle Jesse was acting so unfazed at the funeral, and why he didn't want Olivia coming back from the grave. So she came to you too, huh? My head swiveled to the bedroom door. It was Uncle Jesse, standing there as I held Olivia's testimonial in hand. I looked at the corner where Olivia once stood, but she was gone. "Yo, you killed Olivia?" I quivered. "No, McKenna, it's not like that. Let me explain." I inched back to the far edge of the twin bed, ready to run at a moment's notice. What do you mean she came to me too?" I questioned. "McKenna, calm down, let me explain. I need to tell someone about this. I don't know what to make of it." He stepped to me, outstretching his hands. "I have to get out of here. I know what he's done. I'm next," I thought to myself. As soon as a large enough opening presented itself, I darted behind Uncle Jesse, out of the door, down the stairs, and out of the house, all while looking over my shoulder. But Uncle Jesse never gave chase. I was numb the whole ride home, reliving all the encounters I'd had with Uncle Jesse throughout the years. He loved Olivia so much. How could he do such a thing? I don't even know how I made it home in that condition. It's as if I made it home on instinct. But as my tires came to a halt in my driveway, I remembered. Aunt Lizzie was still in that house with that monster. I had to warn her. Before I could get to my phone, it rang. The caller ID said, Aunt Lizzie. Had he gotten to her already and was calling to taunt me from her phone? How could I be so stupid? I left her behind to die. I carefully lifted the phone to my ear and answered the call. He's dead. Your Uncle Jesse is dead. My Aunt Lizzie cried through a mountain of gut-wrenching tears. A few weeks had passed, and I decided to move in with my Aunt Lizzie. She was all alone in the world now. I was the only family she really had left. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't speak. She just sat there looking at some random wall. It didn't help that the world had this strange sense of irony. You see, my Uncle Jesse had fallen down those same steps as Olivia, and in the same gory fashion, his neck snapped like a twig. I felt there was some poetic justice in how it all happened, but I wished it wouldn't have affected Aunt Lizzie so much. She'd started to make some progress in her mourning process. I no longer had to hand feed her every meal. She made sure to down a few sips of soup every once in a while. She no longer lay in bed until dinner. Noon was often the latest, and her gaze began to unglue itself from the plain white walls that ornated her house. Everything was progressing splendidly. That is until the night they showed up. Aunt Lizzie sat on the couch watching Saturday Night Live, the only thing that seemed to tug at the edges of her mouth, as I cleaned up after our broccoli cheddar chicken supper. It was my favorite dish to cook, and one of the few solids my Aunt Lizzie could stomach, but it sure was a hassle to clean up. I scrubbed and scrubbed the pan, but the breadcrumbs were baked on like old gum on concrete. I plowed my soapy sponge into the sink as I gave a frustrated grunt. I needed something more drastic to clean the pan. I needed my wire brush. I kept it in the cupboard above the fridge, but as I turned around to get it, I gave an ear-piercing shriek. On the other side of the kitchen stood Olivia and Uncle Jesse. Their heads flopped over to the side in almost identical fashion. The decay on Olivia's face was now more prominent, but Jesse's was fresher and less weathered. Though still pale, cold, and grotesque like Olivia's on the day I saw her in her bedroom. Little Olivia held her father's hand by the finger. Uncle Jesse stood paralyzed. That is, until he moved towards the notepad, magnetically stuck to the fridge. He scribbled a few words on the paper and stepped back to let me read what he'd written. He didn't let me explain. I looked back over at him in confusion. Little Olivia tugged on his pant leg, gesturing to let her write on the notepad next. Her father passed the notepad down to her as she pulled her personal crayon from the dress's little pocket. I saw her face concentrate as she wrote some of the few words she knew how to write. When she finished, she flipped the pad over to me. It was hard for me to read it with it being a mix of lowercase and capital letters, not to mention the grammatical mistakes. It read, Mommy dit a t. I mulled over her writing again and again until it finally clicked. Mommy did it. It was all clear to me now. Little Olivia was not trying to warn me about her father, but about her mother. Uncle Jesse wasn't trying to kill me on the day he died. He was trying to explain that he'd had his suspicions about what had actually happened to his daughter. Olivia had given her father the same warning, but it had been too late. Just then, the father and daughter duo raised their fingers simultaneously, pointing behind me. The sound of a drawer opening, along with the rattling of utensils, met my ear. I pivoted slowly. Her eyes were no longer void, no longer sad. Now they were trained on me. My Aunt Lizzie had found a very large kitchen knife. The screams faded into silence, but silence has a way of hiding the next terror waiting to be unleashed. My very own stalker. I know I'm being followed. First it was just a feeling, but now I have concrete evidence. What scares me is the fact that if I just stopped thinking about it, I still wouldn't know that I am being followed. I will tell you how I figured out that I have my very own stalker. It all started 2 days ago. It was a Wednesday morning like any other. I work at a sandwich shop in the town next to mine, so the most convenient way of getting there in time is to take the train. The negative side of my job is that I never work night shifts, so I have to wake up very early every day. The positive side is that all my traveling expenses are paid, and the salary is surprisingly good. While walking towards the train station, which was only like 10 minutes away from my house, I always had headphones on, which is the universal "I don't have the energy to talk to anyone" sign. Of course, headphones don't stop everyone. There's always going to be that one person that desperately wants to talk to me, even though I am obviously not interested. That's exactly what happened while I was on my way to the train station. A man stopped his car just as I was about to cross the road and rolled down the driver's side window. He greeted me with a smile and asked me if I knew where the nearest supermarket is. I took off ones with slight annoyance noticeable on my face. Then I pointed at the direction of the supermarket. He thanked me and immediately sped off in the direction of the supermarket. I continued my walk towards the train station. I already had a monthly ticket, so once I arrived, I immediately entered the train and took a seat. As usual, some man asked me if he could take the seat next to me. "Sure," I said, while not even bothering to look at the man. I didn't sleep long enough last night, and I was just beginning to feel the side effects. I'm sure it only took me around 3 minutes, and I was sound asleep. My phone alarm woke me up just as the train arrived at my station, so I instantly got up and went to the sandwich shop. Luckily for me, it was only 2 minutes away from the train station. Work wasn't too eventful, just the usual stacking cheese, salami, and pickles on sourdough bread for hours and hours. Once I finished work, I remembered I had to meet up with a friend of mine so we can go and watch a movie back at my hometown cinema. I quickly got on the train once again, and after the usual 20-minute ride, I was back in my hometown. Unfortunately, I realized that I would be late if I didn't take the bus, because the cinema was a good 15 minutes walk away from the train station. Fortunately, the train station and bus station are right next to each other, so I managed to hop on the bus, which was overcrowded. But I couldn't complain. I couldn't find a free seat. But it was a short ride, and it's definitely better than arriving late at the cinema. While tightly holding on to the bus pole, a man politely asked me if I could just move to the right so he could put his suitcase next to the pole. I didn't mind, so I slightly shifted to the right, but then a strange feeling hit me. I was always a paranoid person, so having a feeling that someone's watching me wasn't uncommon, but this was definitely more than just paranoia. I turned around and saw just a normal bunch of people minding their own business, which obviously didn't seem unusual. Before I could come to a better conclusion, the bus stopped, so I stopped thinking about it and exited the bus. I met up with my friend minutes later. I was relieved to have made it on time. We took our seats in the packed cinema and tried enjoying the movie, which wasn't easy to do, because some random kids started yelling and laughing as soon as the movie started. Their antics were promptly stopped by a man sitting right behind my friend. He wasn't too happy about their behavior, so he yelled at them, telling them to shut up or he'll personally come over to their seats and shut them up. I found it funny how they immediately went radio silent after the man's warning. He was probably overreacting a little bit, considering they were just kids. But in the end, I couldn't blame him, considering he made our movie night much more bearable. As soon as the movie ended, I told my friend that I'm extremely tired and that I'm just going to go back home and bury myself in the pillow. However, while walking back home, the same feeling of being watched hit me again. In my mind, I started putting the puzzle pieces back together. I came to a dark realization which froze me in place. The man that asked me for directions in the morning, the man that took a seat next to me in the train, the man with the suitcase in the bus, the man that yelled at the kids in the cinema, those were all the same man. Only when I started rewinding what I saw today in my mind is when I realized that this person was following me throughout the day. He only slightly changed his appearance each time I saw him. While he was in the car, he was wearing glasses and a baseball cap. In the train, he was wearing sunglasses, although he wore no cap. In the bus, he was wearing a completely different suit and wasn't wearing any eyewear or hat. In the cinema, he was once again wearing glasses and no cap. What was always the same was his voice. That's the only thing he didn't change. If I focused on it for more than a minute, I could have figured out he was following me hours ago. It could have been a weird coincidence. He could have just been visiting the same places I've been visiting at exactly the same time, but I really doubt it, especially since I saw him once again yesterday. This was all the time I have for today. Tomorrow, I'll try to post an update and tell you what exactly happened yesterday. With the last breath of that tale, another door creaked open, leading to a place far darker than the first. I brought my son clothes shopping. When I looked away for a second, he disappeared. My son's furious screams echoed through the mall as I dragged him toward the clothing store, his feet kicking out in defiance with every step. People were staring as if I were the worst mother, but was too tired to care. His small fists pounded the air, his face flushed with frustration. "I don't want new clothes," he yelled. His shoes scuffed the polished floor as I dragged him forward. I muttered promises of ice cream, hoping to bribe him into submission. "Can we get mint chip ice cream?" he asked as he began to calm. As my son grudgingly stepped into the fitting room, I finally exhaled, hoping for a moment's peace. I glanced at my phone, scrolling through messages as I waited, relieved at the short moment of peace while he tried on the clothes. Minutes passed, and I barely noticed. When I finally looked up, the fitting room was eerily quiet. I called his name, but got no answer. Panic set in as I hurried over to the door, knocking gently. I swung the door open and was stunned to find it empty. The pile of clothes lay untouched on the floor. Where could he have disappeared so quickly? I thought to myself. As I searched around the store, panic turned to absolute dread when I realized there was no sign of him anywhere. The worst thoughts were running through my mind as I screamed his name. People looked at me dumbfounded when I asked them if they had seen my son. When I begged the security guards to check the CCTV, they brought me to the mall's control room. I watched closely at the screens as they scanned through the camera's feeds. When I spotted my son walking out of the store, the security guards were as stunned as I was when the person walking off with my son looked exactly like me. They even drove off in the car I drove to the store in. The police wanted to confirm I wasn't crazy when they suggested they drive me to my address. But when I spotted my car back in the driveway, I felt like I was going completely insane. The two police officers looked at each other when my house key didn't fit in the door lock. "Are you sure this is your address, ma'am?" "My husband will clarify for you who I am," I shouted as I banged down the door. When my husband came to the door, he looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. "Someone kidnapped our..." Suddenly, my son ran out and jumped up into my husband's arms. I was relieved he was home safe, but when the woman I saw on security feed came to the door, I wasn't sure what to believe. "This woman is an imposter," I protested. "I am that boy's mother. Tell them, Sam." "I've never seen this woman in my life, officer. As you can see, my wife is here with me and my boy." The police said the handcuffs were for my own safety as they were putting me in the back of the police car. There was no evidence to suggest I wasn't who I was saying I was, so the police had no reason to keep me once we got back to the police station. Although I promised the police I wouldn't go back to the house, I had no choice. It was my house after all. It felt like I had my identity stolen. There was even a moment where I doubted who I was, but I wasn't crazy, and I knew who I was. I sat outside the house, heart pounding, trying to make sense of the madness. I knew I had to confront them. I gathered my nerve and walked to the door, pounding on it until my husband opened the door. The frustrated and cold expression on my husband's face as my son clung to his leg shattered my soul. "Sam, please, you have to listen to me," I begged. "That woman is an imposter. She's pretending to be me. I don't know how, but you know me. You have to know me." The woman appeared behind him and stood calm and collected. She rested a hand on Sam's shoulder and looked at me with pity in her eyes. "I think you should leave before things get worse for you," she said softly, as if speaking to a lost child. My son stared up at me with a confused look on his face. "Mommy?" he asked, unsure, glancing between us. My heart broke as I crouched down to his level. "Sweetie, it's me," I whispered, tears welling up. "I'm your mom. Remember our favorite bedtime stories? We went to the mall today. You were upset about getting clothes, and we were going to get mint chip ice cream afterward." His face scrunched up in confusion, but before he could say anything, the woman stepped forward. "Honey, we already had mint chip ice cream at home, remember?" she said, kneeling down next to my son. Sam pulled my son close, his eyes narrowing at me. "I don't know what you're trying to pull," he said coldly. "But this is my wife and our son. Please leave us alone." I waded down the street out of sight, keeping my eyes fixed on the house. My mind raced with everything that had happened, and I felt trapped in some twisted nightmare. Hours passed before I saw Sam leave with our son, heading off in his car. I got out of the car and cautiously approached the house as my heart pounded in my chest. As I neared the door, it suddenly opened, and there she was, stepping out onto the porch like she owned the place. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with both rage and fear. "What do you want with my family?" She just smirked, tilting her head slightly. "You're not supposed to be here," she said calmly, as if I were the intruder in my own life. "That's my life inside. You can't just take it," I snapped, stepping closer. Her smile didn't falter. "I already have," she whispered. "You should leave. You don't belong here anymore." I stood frozen as the rage built inside me. As soon as her smug words hit me, something inside snapped. Without thinking, I lunged forward and shoved the imposter into the house. She stumbled back, eyes wide in surprise, before quickly regaining her balance. I rushed in after her, but before I could get another word out, she struck. Her fist slammed into my stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped, doubling over in pain. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. I tried to fight back, but she was terrifyingly strong. She grabbed me by the collar and threw me against the wall, the impact sending shockwaves through my body. Dazed, I scrambled to my feet. My only thought now was survival. She lunged for me again, but I dodged her grasp and ran toward the stairs. I could hear her footsteps pounding behind me, getting closer. My heart raced as I sprinted up the stairs, desperate to get away. But just as I reached the top, she grabbed my ankle, pulling me backward. I kicked out wildly, and in one desperate move, I twisted and shoved her as hard as I could. She toppled backward, tumbling down the stairs. I heard the sickening crack as her neck snapped at the bottom and her body twisted unnaturally. For a moment, there was silence, and I caught my breath, thinking it was over. But then, to my horror, her body twitched. Her head jerked to the side with a grinding noise, and sparks flickered from her neck. She began to rise slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. Pieces of her skin peeled away, revealing metal and wires. She wasn't human, she was a robot. Her eyes flickered, and a distorted voice emerged. "I just wanted to be perfect." "Isn't that what you always wanted?" Suddenly, the light in her eyes flickered and slowly dimmed before she fell to the floor. The front door creaked open, and I froze at the top of the stairs. My heart was pounding as Sam stepped into the house with our son. His smile faded instantly when he saw the mangled android at the bottom of the stairs, sparks flickering from its broken neck. His expression changed from shock to something dark. He slowly set our son down before telling him to wait in the car. As the boy ran outside, Sam's gaze focused back to me, his eyes narrowing in a way I'd never seen before. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he muttered, his voice eerily calm as he approached the stairs. "I thought I had more time to perfect her." I backed away as dread crept up my spine as the weight of his words began sinking in. "Sam, what is this? What did you do?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes drifting toward the broken android. "You always wondered what I did at work, didn't you? I've been working on this for years. Lifelike androids, advanced robotics. She was supposed to be perfect. The perfect wife. The perfect mother. No flaws. No doubts." His voice became bitter as his gaze locked onto mine. "Unlike you." I took a step back, my mind racing. I knew Sam worked for a robotics company, but I had no idea how close he was to creating something so real. Something meant to replace me. "You were going to replace me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not replace," he said, a twisted smile creeping across his face as he took another step closer. "Improve. She was everything you're not. She didn't argue. She didn't fight me. She was obedient, loving, and everything you refused to be." Panic surged through me as he edged closer, his demeanor growing more threatening with every step. "Sam, you can't seriously believe this." I said as the words struggled to get out of my mouth. You tried to build a family? He chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming with something unhinged. I did more than try. I succeeded. My heart pounded in my chest, but all I could think about now was getting out and getting my son and running as far away as possible. I bolted for the door, adrenaline kicking in. You're not taking my son, he shouted. I slammed the door behind me, sprinting for the car, grabbing my boy before Sam could reach us. I booked me and Daniel into a hotel until I figured out what we were going to do next. My heart was still racing from the chaos we just escaped from. The room was quiet, a stark contrast to the horror that had unfolded at the house. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel some relief. We were safe, away from Sam and his twisted creation. Let's get you cleaned up, buddy, I said softly, trying to keep things normal for Daniel. He smiled up at me, innocent and unaware of the nightmare we'd just fled. I filled the tub with warm water and helped him in, watching as he relaxed, splashing happily. For the first time all day, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I sat on the edge of the tub, running my hand through his hair, grateful that we'd made it out together. But then, something strange happened. Daniel's movements grew stiff and jerky. He stopped splashing, and his head tilted to the side in an unnatural way. My heart dropped. "Mommy, I don't feel good," he said, his voice distorted. Water fizzled around him, and I saw tiny, almost invisible sparks at first coming from his neck. "No," I whispered, backing away in horror. His skin began to peel, revealing metal and wires underneath. Sam hadn't just built the perfect wife. He was trying to build the perfect family. What was forgotten in the blood-stained memories of the past would soon resurface in the horror yet to come. Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities. There were 3 of us, me, Jay, and Mike. We'd been friends since we were kids, the kind of bond you don't break, even when life starts pulling you in different directions. College had done that to us, but now, standing on the edge of graduation, we figured there was time for one last road trip before the real world got its claws into us. I had the idea, just load up in Mike's beat-up old Subaru and drive. No destination in mind, no agenda. Just go. One last adventure. We packed light, mostly energy drinks and snacks, and left early that Saturday morning. Jay rode shotgun, messing with the radio as I sprawled out in the back, watching the landscape blur by. Mike was driving. He always drove. He was the calmest, most level-headed of the 3 of us. Jay was more impulsive, and was always hyped about something, whether it was the next party or his latest failed scheme. Me, I was just happy to be along for the ride. It had always been like that. A few hours in, we left behind the more familiar towns, and the roads got lonelier. The kind of highways that stretched on forever, surrounded by flat, endless fields and the occasional abandoned house. We passed towns so small you'd miss them if you blinked. Jay kept joking about how this was the kind of place where people go missing. Where serial killers bury the bodies, he said, laughing. At the time, we all did. But by the time the sun started dipping low, the excitement had faded, and boredom set in. We'd been driving for hours, and the road ahead didn't look any more exciting than the miles behind us. Mike suggested stopping for the night. We hadn't seen a motel or even a gas station for at least an hour, but we decided to push through the next 50 miles to the next town. Then we saw it, a small, weathered billboard on the side of the road. It read, "Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities, 2 miles ahead." House of Oddities? Jay leaned forward, squinting at the sign. What, like a Ripley's Believe It or Not? Seems like it, Mike said. Want to check it out? Hell yeah, Jay grinned. I mean, this kind of stuff is why we're out here, right? I shrugged. Why not? A couple of miles later, we saw it. A squat old building that looked more like a rundown farmhouse than a museum. The paint was peeling and the yard was overgrown with weeds and odd sculptures, twisted metal things that didn't make much sense. A faded wooden sign hung above the door. Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities. Looks interesting, I muttered, climbing out of the car. Looks like a horror movie waiting to happen, Jay added with a smirk. But fuck it, let's go. Mike chuckled, locking the car as we headed for the entrance. I slowly opened the front door, unsure of whether the place was actually still open. An old brass bell rang with the swinging of the door, and there he was, Mr. McGuire. He was something else. short, maybe 5'4", with a wild mop of silver hair that stuck out in every direction. His eyes were too wide, and his grin stretched across his face like it had been painted on. He wore a faded purple vest over a yellow shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing skinny, wiry arms. He looked like a carnival barker who had seen better days and had one too many cups of coffee. "Ah, visitors!" he exclaimed, his voice high-pitched and sing-songy. "Welcome, welcome. Come in, come in. Oh, it's been so long since I've had guests. You'll love it here. Yes, you will. Yes, you will." We exchanged glances, half laughing at the guy, but followed him inside. The interior was dimly lit with a strange, musty smell that hit me the second we crossed the threshold. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bizarre knickknacks and trinkets, things I couldn't even begin to describe. Weird animal bones, dolls with too many eyes, jars filled with murky liquids that sloshed as we passed. Mr. McGuire danced around the room, pointing things out with an almost manic glee. This is the skull of a two-headed calf born in 1912, he chirped, holding up a bleached white skull with a grin. And over here, ah yes, the hand of a mummified man. Some say he was a sorcerer. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Jay leaned in close to me and whispered, "This dude is insane." "Yeah," I muttered back, but there was something about the place, something unsettling that I couldn't shake. The way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, the faint smell of decay beneath the mustiness. And here, McGuire's voice pulled me back. "Oh, this is a rare find indeed. The preserved heart of a witch, still beating to this day." I glanced at the jar he held. Sure enough, the dark, shriveled lump inside was pulsing faintly, but undeniably. I took a step back, my skin crawling. Mike, though, seemed fascinated. "How do you do that?" "I mean, it's got to be a trick, right?" Mr. McGuire's grin widened. "Oh, there are many tricks here, my boy. Many secrets. Some things are best left a mystery, wouldn't you agree?" Mike nodded, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression. Jay, on the other hand, was already bored. "All right, cool stuff, man. What else you got?" "Oh, there's so much more." McGuire practically bounced on his feet. Follow me, follow me. This is just the beginning." He led us deeper into the museum, through narrow hallways lined with grotesque taxidermy. Creatures that looked like they'd been stitched together from nightmares. A fox with human eyes, a bird with too many wings, a snake with the head of a cat. Jay laughed it off, but I could tell even he was getting creeped out. Jay stayed close to McGuire, asking questions about the exhibits, fascinated by every macabre detail. I hung back, keeping my distance. Something about the air felt thick, oppressive. I started to feel like we shouldn't have come here. We rounded a corner into another room, and that's when I noticed something strange. Mike wasn't with us anymore. "Where's Mike?" I asked, glancing around. Jay frowned. "I don't know, man. He was just behind us." McGuire's grin didn't falter. "Oh, don't worry. He must have wandered off to explore. Happens all the time. People get lost in the wonders of this place." "Yeah, but," I started. But McGuire was already moving again, leading Jay deeper into the labyrinth. My gut twisted. Something wasn't right. I turned back, calling Mike's name. No response. I retraced my steps, walking back through the narrow halls, past the grotesque creatures and jars of preserved organs, but Mike was nowhere to be found. "Mike?" I called louder, panic creeping into my voice. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. The musty smell started to make me feel sick. I stumbled back into the room with the heart in the jar and my stomach lurched. The heart wasn't beating anymore. It was still, lifeless. I bolted back to Jay and McGuire, who were now in some kind of workshop. The walls were lined with tools, saws, scalpels, things I didn't want to think about. Jay was staring at something on the table. "What the hell is that freaking thing?" Jay asked McGuire as I approached. "Jay, we need to go," I said, grabbing his arm. He didn't move. Just stood there, eyes growing wide, staring at what I now saw was a human skull. But it wasn't just any skull. It looked fresh. Too fresh. The flesh still clung to the bone in some places, and the eyes... God, the eyes were still in their sockets, staring blankly up at the ceiling. "Jay, we need to go now." I pulled harder, and he finally snapped out of it, nodding quickly. Yeah, let's go." But as we turned to leave, Mr. McGuire was standing in the doorway, his grin wider than ever. "Oh, you can't leave yet, boys," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "The tour's not over." I glanced at Jay, who was trembling now. "What did you do with Mike?" I demanded. McGuire's smile faltered just for a second. "He's around. Everyone finds their place here eventually." I didn't wait for him to say more. I shoved past him, dragging Jay behind me, and bolted for the front door. The museum felt like it had grown, the hallways twisting in ways I didn't remember. Every corner led to another room, another grotesque display. I could hear McGuire behind us, his footsteps light but relentless, his voice echoing through the halls, singing some twisted, cheerful tune. We ran faster, my heart pounding in my chest, lungs burning, but every door we found was locked, every window barred. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the whole place felt suffocating. And then we saw it, the exit, the door we'd come through. I threw myself at it, turning the knob, praying it wasn't locked. It wasn't. We burst through, gasping for air as we stumbled outside. It was completely dark outside now, and the twisted sculptures in the yard seemed to loom over us, their shapes looking even more menacing in the moonlight. We didn't stop. We ran to the car, and I glanced back at the house. The door was still open, and I could see McGuire standing there, his grin visible even from a distance. Fuck. Jay? Mike? Has the keys. We didn't hesitate. We ran until our legs were spaghetti and our lungs screamed. I'm not sure how long we ran. When we were sure we were safe, we collapsed, exhausted. It felt like a miracle when a truck stopped and let us hitch a ride to the next town over. We spent the next few hours in silence, neither of us knowing what to say, not making sense of what happened. Mike, we never found him, never heard from him again. We reported it to the police, but when they went to investigate, the museum was gone. Not abandoned, just gone, like it had never been there at all. Jay and I went through months of interviews and even were suspects ourselves for a time, but nothing ever came of it. Jay and I don't talk much these days. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the look on McGuire's face the last time I saw him, the way his eyes glittered with something inhuman. We may have never found Mike, but I know where he is. He is still there, in Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities. I remember what McGuire said. Everyone finds their place here eventually. I can't help but feel like Mike is stuck in that place, turned into one of those horrible exhibits. The story shattered like glass, and through the cracks, another nightmare began to bleed into reality. Orion Pest Control, the devil you know. There was a roar in the forest that woke the whole town at approximately 1:15 a.m. Not long after my eyes snapped open, fully awake despite the hour, Victor called me. He only wanted the most experienced of Orion, not wanting to drag our trainees into something that could potentially be beyond our scope. If you're not familiar with what Orion Pest Control services are, it may help to start here. I found Deirdre, who'd spent the night on my couch, staring out the window, face grim. It was a slaughter. She breathed, eyes distant as though her mind was elsewhere. The spirit of the forest is nearly broken. Whenever she has these moments of foresight, she has advised me that it's best to simply leave her be, as awful as I feel doing it. She has assured me that she is accustomed to seeing such tragedies. Weepers can get violent if their premonitions are interrupted. So that's what I did. I swallowed my guilt and walked out the door. As I passed by the other apartments, I heard confused voices chattering behind closed doors. Lights were on. The braver, more reckless residents snuck peeks between their blinds and curtains, hoping to catch a glimpse at whatever could have made the sound. When I arrived at the darkened trees, I asked for permission to enter the forest. There was no reply. Well, that's not good. Hesitantly, I stepped across the threshold of the forest. Still, nothing. It was quiet. Nothing disturbed the brush or the leaves. Even the wind held its breath. It felt different in the false trees' woods. Before that night, you could feel its eyes on you wherever you went, could tell that it was listening to you, scrutinizing you. Now, it felt far too open, as if the trees were endless, yet empty, with no critters to occupy them. After traipsing through the darkness for a bit, there was finally a noise, the rustling of something approaching me through the fallen leaves. As I trained my flashlight on it, I found that the footsteps belonged to a dog. Right off the bat, I recognized the dog for what it truly was, despite having only read about them. Though to tell the truth, I had expected it to be more intimidating. Its white fur practically glowed as it sat politely on the ground in front of me. While it was a fairly big dog, its little wiry mustache made it look more like a dapper old man than one of the dreaded hounds of the wild hunt. What gave the animal away as a member of the Kunanun were its floppy red ears, stained the color of fresh blood. "Hi," I said to the hound. It let out a soft oof and stood, looking at me like it wanted me to follow it, its red-tipped tail wagging. I obliged, letting the hound lead the way. While I was following it, the dog abruptly stopped, letting out a low whine. Next to it was a mound of brown fur. As I got closer, I was met with the sight of two disemboweled coyotes, their intestines leaking red onto the leaves below them. Blood coated their muzzles. Oh God, poor things. The dog yipped, staring at me expectantly. Time to keep moving. Nothing I could do for the coyotes now. We encountered more dead animals on our path, a scattering of birds of varying species. Robins, buzzards, blue jays, hawks, even a bald eagle. All gutted like the coyotes, glassy eyes staring at nothing. Briar's voice arose from the trees. "It's like this everywhere." Quickly, I turned towards where I heard him speak. He was crouched by a dead buck, tracing its antlers. For the first time since I'd met the hunter, he looked solemn, kneeling before the deer in front of him as if grieving for it. The hound let out a soft bark. Eyes distant, Briar told me that I'd better keep following the dog. I didn't have to guess who the hound was leading me to. Eventually, I saw the beam of two more flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. They were illuminating the false tree. Not long after, a lantern provided the area with a subtle pale glow, making the surrounding trees appear even taller than they had before. The smell of pine was overpowering as I drew nearer. The shepherd of the forest was small. It had shrunk down to the size of a child. It was crumpled down in the epicenter of the carnage, bark-covered hands over its eyes as its shoulders shook. This time, I didn't see any squirrels or birds in its beard. Sap leaked from numerous gashes in its bark. Raina had lowered herself down to sit next to it. She didn't try to touch the false tree or the poor, dead raccoon beside her, just reminding the distraught neighbor that it wasn't being left to deal with its misery alone. The hound had trotted away, coming to sit next to what appeared to be a woman at first. However, she had the same bright, intense gaze that Iolo and Briar had, the keen eyes of a hunter. She reached down to scratch the hound's ears as it guarded her. From my left, I faintly heard the mechanic's voice, speaking quietly in Gaelic. In the light of the lantern, I could see him on one knee before a dead black bear, similar to how Briar had been, gently stroking the unfortunate animal's ears. In sharp contrast to his comforting voice and movements, he was wearing the same murderous expression I'd seen from him that night, that he'd chased me within an inch of my life. I held back a shudder at the memory. It occurred to me that the huntsmen were giving funerary rites. They were treating those animals with the respect and dignity of fallen warriors. Before I could ask any of them about what did this, I saw it. A cookie hanging from a tree. I swore under my breath. Victor came over to stand by me, confirming my suspicions. Hag tried hunting in the shepherd's forest. When the female hunter spoke, I recognized her deep, husky voice instantly. She'd been in the church when I stole the ledger. She lured 2 young ones into these woods. I've sent them home with one of my hounds. It will watch over them. That explanation made unfortunate sense. False trees are extremely protective of human children, especially if they reside in close proximity to the tree's forest. False trees have been known to lead lost kids out of their woods, or to show them where to find safe berries or mushrooms to eat if they're hungry. As such, the false tree wouldn't allow for 2 children to be brutally murdered in its home, and it had paid a terrible price for it. Iolo approached the false tree, kneeling before it, his tone just as delicate as it had been as he offered those poor animals his blessings. Raina gave them some space, coming over to join me, her flashlight showing even more death around us. She whispered to Vic and me, "They're discussing what the false tree wants to do with the bodies. Whatever they decide, I'm going to offer Orion's services," Victor muttered. Clearly, humans aren't the only ones at stake when it comes to the hag. If she can do this to a false tree, of all things, what else is she capable of? Briar appeared from where he'd been giving last rites to the other fallen animals, waiting patiently beside the female hunter, hands in his pockets. Iolo eventually straightened up, waving his colleagues over as he strode over to join my coworkers and me. "We'll be giving the poor things a proper send-off," he informed us. "There's a lone ash tree in a hill about 5 minutes north of here. Shepherd wants 'em buried there. Best leave us to it." Victor replied, "It'll take a long time with just you three. We can help gather them up." Apparently, that was the wrong thing to say. The mechanic warned, "Now is not the time to try to get a debt over me, Blue Eyes. I'm offering this freely with no expectations in return." Victor explained calmly, "We're here for the false tree. No other reason. You can read my mind, if that'll assure you." He stiffened when the mechanic took him up on it, beginning to search his eyes. Reyna held me back from trying to stop it. Eventually, once Iolo found what he was looking for, he said, "Fine." With that, I saw Victor's shoulders relax as the huntsman stopped digging through his head. There's a part of me that wishes that the boss would bite the bullet and name him. Though, I understand why he doesn't want to be bound to the mechanic, so I haven't pushed it. His demeanor slightly less murderous, Iolo continued. "Shepherd gave us permission to pull the trucks in, provided we mind where we're driving. It'll still take some time, but better than trying to do it all by hand." Victor nodded, seemingly completely recovered from having his mind read. "Sounds good." Gathering up the animals took a long time, even with all of us cooperating with each other. There were just so many of them. We all had a job to do. Briar and Victor did the majority of the digging. Reyna, the huntress, and I were mainly responsible for locating and loading up each animal. The hound was a big help in making sure that we didn't miss even a single bird or chipmunk. Meanwhile, the mechanic alternated between carting the bodies around and helping the other two dig. As heartbreaking as the entire scene was, it got even worse when Reyna found a skunk that was a spitting image of Fireball. She hid her tears well. I would have cried too. By the time we got the last of the bodies to the ash tree, the sky was beginning to lighten with the impending rise of the sun. Though we were all filthy and exhausted by that point, even the dog was flopped on the ground, panting hard. We brought the false tree to the ash and held a little funeral for its treasured guardians. It sat silently, the green glow of its eyes flickering like firelight. It listened as each of us offered words of blessings. The false tree pressed a hand to its chest and bowed deeply, its booming voice deep with sorrow. "The forest will remember your kindness. I know that the forest's guardian will need time to recover, both emotionally and physically, but giving its fallen friends a proper send-off seemed like a good place to start." As I watched the false tree make the journey down the hill and back into its forest, I noticed that it was letting itself grow tall again. In the days following the massacre, we've gone back to give it offerings to aid in its recovery. It's been 3 days and already, birds are beginning to sing in the trees once again. Once the impromptu ceremony was complete, Briar, who'd been slumped on the ground after digging all those graves, slowly rose to his feet, shocking Victor by offering him a hand up. Reyna and I exchanged a glance. Weird. Them being nice was weird. She looked helplessly at Victor. "We're not going into work today, right?" He shook his head, looking as drained as I felt. "If the newbies have an issue, they can call me. At this point, they should be able to handle a day without us." "Do they know that?" I asked. "They will in a minute." The boss didn't have to tell us twice. Sleep and a shower were in order, and ibuprofen. As we were all about to part ways, Iolo caught my arm, whispering, "I've thought about it, talk later." He took off before I could ask when later was, but at least it wasn't an outright no. There was still a chance. I still had a chance at freedom. If I had been more aware, I would have thought to be nervous. Unfortunately, I was exhausted. My brain was short-circuiting. When I returned, I saw that Deirdre was back to herself again, having recovered from her premonition. Naturally, when she saw the state I was in, she was concerned. I caught her up as best as I could before stalking off to wash off all the dirt and gore off of me. When I finally got settled into bed, she found her way in, resting her head on my shoulder. I held her close, snuggling her not unlike how I used to clutch my stuffed bunny as a kid. As we laid together, the warmth of her embrace and the gentle rhythm of her breathing eventually lured me into a corpse-like sleep. Pounding at the door startled me awake. For a brief, terrible moment, I pictured my father at the other side of it, muscles and nerve endings exposed. Deirdre let out a soft murmur, stirring but not waking. It took a second for me to calm down, to remind myself that the sperm donor was out of his misery now. Another knock. Wait, it was dark outside. What time was it? My heart began to race as I checked my phone, discovering to my horror that I'd somehow slept for 12 hours. Oh, he's going to kill me. I sprang out of bed, scaring the crap out of poor Deirdre as I raced to answer the door, telling her quickly to stay where she was and to keep quiet. Oh God, if he finds out she's here, she and I will both be in deep shit. When I answered the door, the mechanic chuckled, looking me up and down. I must have looked as flustered as I felt. Before he could say something, I blurted out, I honestly just woke up. I've never crashed this hard before. While his tone and smirk were playful, I could tell by the tightness of his eyes that he was annoyed. Stop your groveling and let me in. Act normal. Don't be suspicious. I broke the line of salt at my door, letting him cross the threshold, hoping that he wouldn't question why I was so antsy. Iolo glanced at the book Deirdre had been reading, left marked on the coffee table. Didn't peg you much for the reading type. I've been trying to get back into it. Technically, not a lie. I just haven't been trying very hard. Thankfully, he didn't comment further, making himself comfortable on my couch. So we gotta talk about your offer. What's there to talk about? His eyes slitted. I didn't invest all this time into you just to give you up now. But at the same time, the Baker situation is bigger than our little feud. She's gotta go. You're right. It's not just us being affected, I conceded. I want to stop the cookie hag before anyone or anything else gets hurt. However, that all being said, I can't just let you take me. He smiled. Like I said, Fiona, I ain't letting you go just like that. Looks like we're gonna have to negotiate. I swallowed, shaking my head. I can't be a hunter. I'm not willing to negotiate that. His gaze darkened, that grin not faltering. I recall you telling me once that you'd never sacrifice others to save your own skin. Seems an awful lot like that's what you're doing now. My heart began to beat harder, not just from nerves, but from anger. You're the one being stubborn this time. All you have to do is release me. Then the hag is all yours. He sighed impatiently, leaning forward to rest his forearms on his thighs, his voice becoming chillingly soft. All you have to do is tell me what she's looking for, and you best do that. Today is not the day to push me, Fiona. My mouth was suddenly horribly dry. I swallowed, but it didn't provide any relief. With the state he was in, he wouldn't be receptive to a word I said. I needed some way to calm him down. Forcing myself to take a deep breath, I politely excused myself before darting to the fridge, feeling his gaze burning into my back the entire time. I had a few jars of fresh cream saved up, courtesy of one of the local dairy farms. In my line of work, it's always good to have some on hand. Though, with Deirdre visiting so often, I must admit that I have been going through them quicker than usual. As I grabbed one, I urged, before you completely shoot me down, just listen, please. When I closed the refrigerator, I wasn't surprised to find that he'd pulled a classic slasher movie villain move, appearing ominously behind the door. Unlike the doomed characters in those films, I didn't freak out, just simply offered him the cream without fanfare. The mechanic wordlessly accepted it, leaning back against my kitchen counter. I gave him a moment to open the jar, watching the dark expression lessen somewhat as he took a sip. At least that's one thing all neighbors have in common, whether they're housekeepers of wild huntsmen. To quote Inglorious Bastards, attendez la crème. All right, he said with a sigh, sounding less prickly than he had mere seconds ago. I'm listening. I chose my words carefully. I want to keep my mortality and my humanity. I don't want to be transformed in any way, not even into a hunter like you, Briar, or the huntress with the hounds. And especially do not want to end up like the crows. I want to remain exactly as I am. That it? He asked lightly, taking another drink. Steeling myself, I continued, I also don't want you to hurt the Keening woman, the one I've befriended specifically. He snickered. You mean the one hiding in your bedroom? My heart stopped. Yeah, I knew, he said before sipping at the cream again. Only reason why I haven't done anything about it is 'cause of that fucking stone. That, and it'd be poor form. We're here to discuss the cookie hag, I reminded him uneasily. That's what's important right now. I know, he replied coolly. He thoughtfully took another drink. After leaving me in suspense as he deliberated, he eventually announced, "I'll let you keep your precious fucking humanity, but you're gonna have to let the keening woman fight her own battles." I ain't budging on that. She's had it coming for a while. I wanted to argue. I was terrified for her. But she'd told me the same thing as he did, to let her worry about him, to focus on keeping myself safe first. That being said, he continued after finishing off the jar with a pleased sigh, "You're gonna keep training to be a hero. Like I said, I didn't do all this work just to let it all go now." He still wanted to make me a tool of the wild hunt. That wasn't going to change. But at least if I could get him to agree to this, I wouldn't have to worry about being forcibly transformed into something inhuman, possibly even having my will stripped away. For the moment, that was the best I could hope for. But to be clear, you'll let me stay human? You won't make me into anything else? Yup, as long as you make good on this promise to stop the baker. I glared at him. You can't get anyone else to make me a hunter either. He smirked wickedly. All right, you got me. Nobody under my command'll make you into anything either. Tricky fucker. And you can't call in any favors from anyone that isn't under your command. No involving anyone outside of your hunting party. He shrugged a shoulder, still looking entirely too untrustworthy. Fine. Am I forgetting something? What else could there be? He's a bastard. He's got to be up to something. God, why can't he just be an idiot like Briar? So, just to outline everything, I reiterated, a hand raised. I will do my part to get rid of the hag, and in return, you swear that you and yours will refrain from turning me into a creature of the hunt. And the training, he reminded me brusquely. My bedroom door creaked open, interrupting us. While the mechanic's expression didn't change, the air suddenly felt much colder as Deirdre appeared, her face drawn in concern. I stared at her with wide eyes. "What happens on Samhain?" she questioned. The mechanic's chuckle made me freeze in place. "Can't ever seem to mind your business, can ya?" Deirdre, however, didn't allow herself to be intimidated, arguing, "She is my business." He laughed again, shaking his head as he said sardonically, "Oh, bless your heart." Since he made it clear that he wasn't going to answer her incredibly good question, I doubled down on it. "If you're letting me stay human, then the Samhain deadline doesn't matter anymore, right?" He continued to gaze at her as if trying to determine the most efficient way to dismember her as he answered, "No, it still matters." "Why?" I demanded. "Because we're going to have an unwanted visitor." He gave me a harsh sideways glance. "And as you probably knew already, the White Son of Mist gathers us all to join him in a great hunt that night. Because of that, I won't be available to stop it." "Oh, here we go. What visitor?" He then said two words that I truly dreaded to hear. "A Dullahan." My jaw dropped. Similarly, Deirdre let out a soft groan, seeming to share my dismay. Yins know the legend of Sleepy Hollow? It doesn't do the Dullahan justice. While we, luckily, haven't encountered one at Orion yet, our friends at the River Kings had the misfortune of dealing with one 2 Samhains ago. When it left Cuyahoga Falls, it took the souls of 12 victims with it, including one of their newest recruits. And now, Iolo wanted me to fight one. Seeing my shocked expression, he smirked. "Still so keen on being human? Dullahan'll be a lot easier to deal with as one of us." "No," I said quickly. We'll find a way to drive it off." His eyes bore into me. "You better." Deirdre furrowed her brows, regarding him suspiciously. "There's still something you're not telling her." Without missing a beat, Iolo casually replied, "Take off the hagstone, and I'll be an open book, even about things y'all didn't even think to ask." I balked. "Absolutely not. Come on, Cowinad, you care about her, don't ya?" He then asked with a devilish smirk, completely ignoring me. "You wouldn't just let her stumble into a deal with me completely blind, would ya?" "You evil fucking." Deirdre raised her chin obstinately. "You're right. I wouldn't. I have seen her suffer greatly because of you, and I have no desire to see it continue." "Stop talking about me like I'm not here," I snapped. "We don't have time for this. This interpersonal bullshit can await. We have a hag that wants to do God knows what to everyone and everything here." Anyways, Iolo started as if I were merely some child throwing a tantrum. "You take off that hagstone, and in 5 minutes, I'll be the most open and honest I've ever been in my wicked life. 5 minutes for me to settle the score with ya. That's all it'll take." Deirdre looked at me apologetically, pleading with her eyes for me to simply trust her, to let her help me. Even though it was coming at her expense, I can't let her do this. Wait, no, this is her decision to make, not mine. I can't control her, even if I think it's what's best for her. She's told me time and time again to let her handle him. She'd managed to trick Briar into getting some strange Weeper blood depression. She knows Iolo's name. She's not completely defenseless. With a shaky sigh, I reluctantly nodded, hoping she had some sort of trick up her sleeve. Deirdre went back to facing down the mechanic. There is clearly something you need to get out of your system when it comes to me, though I do feel the need to remind you that the consequences for killing me would be dire, even for you, Huntsman. I'll make sure you live through it. His callous assurance only made my blood pressure spike higher. Tell me your intentions. He let the hatred he felt for her reach his eyes as he answered. You've touched her heart. Only fair I should touch yours. Deirdre didn't seem nearly as shaken by his response as I was. She merely appeared to be resolved to whatever fate the mechanic had in mind. If it's for her, the Weeper muttered, delicately placing her hagstone on my kitchen table, next to Ratcatcher. I am willing to sacrifice 5 minutes of peace. She then stepped out of the hagstone's range of protection, awaiting him patiently with her eyelids fluttering shut. The mechanic approached her slowly, glaring at her skeptically. He told her to open her eyes. She calmly replied that he was going to have to make her. He smirked at the challenge. It's hard to describe what happened next. No, I take that back. What I should say is that it's hard to process what happened. He simply reached into her chest as if it was made of cream cheese. Deirdre let out a shaky gasp as he began to caress her internal organs, his eyes not leaving her face the entire time. I was shaking, watching it. Watching her flinch as he squeezed her heart. I don't even want to know what that would have felt like. It makes me shrink inside myself when I imagine how unnatural and gruesome that sensation would be. To have his calloused fingers toying with my innards as if they were the strings of his banjo. He glanced nonchalantly at the clock. Deirdre clenching her teeth as he traced along her ribcage, the imprint of his fingers visible under her pale skin. My stomach turned. I had to look away, feeling bile rising in my throat, gripping my sink with shaking hands. She still hadn't opened her eyes. You're a lot tougher than you look, he commented, sounding somewhat impressed. There was a terrible ripping sound as he suddenly withdrew his hand from her chest. He'd let her go early. Deirdre stumbled back towards the hagstone, feeling blindly, not opening her eyes until it was back in her hand. Now that we got that out of the way, Iolo's bloodied hand gripped my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. I ain't fucking around about the Dullahan, but if you really want to keep your humanity, you best make sure the White Son of Mist never sees you. I can keep the ones under my command from trying something, but what my king wants, he gets. I'm fairly confident he'd want you. And this year, my chapter of the hunt is hosting him. Gwynap Nudd is going to be here too. Great. Wonderful. Happy Halloween to everyone but my little corner of Pennsylvania, I guess. And I accept the terms we discussed, Fiona. Now, you best tell me what the baker asked you for. One of your instruments, I snapped, trying to jerk my chin out of his grasp. He didn't let me. And how do I know you ain't just gonna hand what's mine over to her? It would be in your best interest, after all. Because despite everything, you're still the lesser of two evils, I growled. This morning assured me of that. As horrible as the mechanic is, at the end of the day, he's still a neighbor. As such, there are rules he's bound to, though he's terribly good at bending and skirting around them. If the cookie hag has any guidelines to abide by, I don't know what they are. Yins know that old saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. He sighed, saying, all right, we'll work something out. Clearly wanting to add insult to Deirdre's injury, his lips then brushed against mine briefly before he released me, leaving a bloody handprint on my skin. You two have a nice evening, he said as he stalked toward the door, smirking as he added, it was a real pleasure doing business with you both. Once he was gone, I instantly rushed to Deirdre's side, needing to make sure she was okay. But how could anyone be okay after that? She was turned away from me, her shoulders shaking. Tears welled in my eyes as I seized her shoulders, wishing I could do something, anything to help her. Imagine my surprise to see that she was laughing, a hand over her mouth to keep the sound from reaching the huntsman's ears through the thin walls. Naturally, I was thrown for a loop, glancing between her and the door as I breathed, "Am I missing something?" She held up one finger, indicating to be quiet, still barely stifling her laughter. Still thoroughly confused, I rushed to the peephole, watching as another tenant seemed to either not notice or care as Iolo walked past her, hand and wrist still stained red. I waited until I saw the truck's taillights halfway down the road before telling Deirdre that he was gone. When I turned back to her, her smile was mischievous. "I'm terribly sorry to not have mentioned this to you before, Nessa, but I wasn't sure how good of an actress you are. I didn't want to risk giving away my little secret." "What secret?" I asked, feeling a tear escape my eye. She gently wiped it away. She then cheekily whispered to me, "My time in the river dulled my senses. I didn't feel Briar's thorns, and I didn't feel a single thing that happened a moment ago. The huntsman can't harm me." I blinked my tears away in disbelief. "But hold on, it was all a show," she explained, "but I had to make it convincing. Now that I understood, I was laughing with her, hugging her, relieved. So relieved." "You really couldn't feel any of that?" I confirmed in disbelief. It looked horrible." The weeper continued to beam up at me. "No harm done, none whatsoever. I told you not to worry about me." Her kiss erased the one he forced onto me. I cradled her, stroking her hair, still utterly amazed at her. Even now, I am astonished at her ingenuity. That was when something occurred to me that was painful to consider. Reluctantly, I broke our kiss to ask, "Wait, if you can't feel pain, then can you feel anything else?" She looked down with a tinge of regret. "I'm afraid not." "Oh," Deirdre continued, her thumb grazing my cheek affectionately, "though I still enjoy being close to you. The river may have taken away my ability to feel things physically, but my heart is still intact, despite your suitor's best efforts, of course." Maybe that's why her hugs are so tight. She can't feel how hard she squeezes. Upon further discussion, the only thing she is able to feel is the tug of the river. She then added with a mischievous smirk, "And I must admit that I do enjoy using my numbness to get the huntsman to do my bidding. What better way could there be to refute those that enjoy causing pain than to simply not feel pain?" Once again, Deirdre had the last laugh over the wild hunt. "As of right now, the cookie hag hasn't attacked anyone else, human or neighbor, but I'm certain that it's only a matter of time. When it comes to taking her down and avenging the false tree, Iolo agreed to meet with the boss tomorrow to discuss a plan of action. I'll let Yins know the results of that when I can." The wind carried away the final whispers, but it also brought with it the chilling whispers of a new terror. Nightside, I had this incredibly weird and vivid dream that left me unsettled even after waking up. It wasn't like a typical nightmare, but something deeper, a world that felt wrong in every sense. The imagery, the darkness, and the way everything unfolded were so strange that it lingered with me long after. So I decided to turn it into a story, giving it structure while sticking closely to what I experienced in the dream. The fear I felt in the dream was more about what was left unexplained, and I wanted to capture that in the writing. Here's how it played out. There's a feeling I get sometimes when I look out my window at night, like the world's been drained of something. It's not the silence, not the dark, but something else. Something you can't name but can feel deep down. It's like the world isn't asleep, it's waiting. I first felt that when I moved into my apartment. I never liked the place. The walls were too thin, the lights flickered, and the air always felt damp, no matter how long I ran the heat. It was cheap though, and close to campus. Jaylene hated it too. She never said it out loud, but I could see it in her face every time she visited. Jaylene still lived with her parents. She loved them, but I knew how much the weight of tradition hung over her, what was expected of her in their eyes. She didn't mind the culture or the closeness, but it was hard for her to stay. I didn't push her to move in with me. She wasn't ready. Still, part of me thought that maybe, if we had a new place together, things would finally feel normal, like that tension, the kind you don't say out loud, would ease. I told her this the last time she came over, her dark eyes scanning the peeling walls. "I just hate it here. I said, more to fill the space than expecting a real response. Jaylene opened her mouth to say something, but the sound cut her off. At first, I wasn't even sure it was real, just this low rustling, too soft, too out of place. It was coming from the hallway. Neither of us moved, but I could see Jaylene tense up, her eyes fixing on the door. The sound grew louder, not like footsteps, but more like something dragging itself along the floor. Slow, deliberate. I didn't need to think. Not really. It was as if something primal switched on inside me, the kind of instinct that doesn't ask questions. My hand found hers, and in that second I knew she felt it too, that deep, undeniable need to run. Without speaking, we moved toward the window. There was no logic in what we were doing. Just that buzzing at the base of my spine, like every cell in my body screamed for me to get out. The fire escape rattled as we climbed down. My car was parked below, and the thought of leaving this place, this cursed, oppressive apartment, pushed me forward. We slammed the doors shut as soon as we hit the ground, the sound of metal and glass vibrating in the quiet. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life, but something made me pause. I didn't know what, but I didn't want to look back. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, I wished I hadn't. It was there, a shadow, massive, on all fours, its shape barely registering. It wasn't the kind of thing you could fully grasp. Its form didn't make sense. I couldn't process what I was seeing, just this inhuman silhouette creeping toward us, like it was pulling itself through the darkness. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as we flew down the street, the pavement barely visible beneath us. Jaylene clutched the door, her breath quick, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the road. I couldn't let myself think about what I'd seen, or if it was still following us. The streetlights above us barely worked, casting only a faint purple glow that seemed swallowed by the darkness. The road stretched on endlessly, an abyss. It wasn't like this before, not this empty, not this dark. Then, from nowhere, another car appeared. It barreled down the road, headlights off, moving fast. I barely had time to react, swerving to avoid it, but instead of crashing into us, it rammed into the creature. The impact was deafening, the metal car crushing the shadow against a nearby building. I saw the black mass twist and contort, trapped between bricks and twisted metal. I didn't slow down. My heart pounded in my chest, and before I knew it, we were following the other car. It drove ahead of us, leading us deeper into the city. It didn't feel real. None of it did. But the car seemed to know where it was going, so I followed, the roads narrowing as we went. There were no signs, no lights, just an endless stretch of black, barely illuminated by the purple streetlights overhead. Eventually, we reached a place, if you could even call it that. A fortress, built from the remains of old buildings and scrap metal. It looked thrown together like the people there were holding off something much worse than the creature we'd just seen. We pulled up, engines still running. There were people, but something about them was wrong. At first it was subtle. They looked like any other survivors, tired, worn out. But the way they moved, it didn't seem right. Too slow, like they weren't used to their own bodies. Jaylene leaned closer, her voice low. Something's off. I felt it too. It wasn't just the way they moved, it was their eyes. Too blank, too far away, like they were watching something inside their own heads. Not us. A man came forward, his body stiff, his arms hanging unnaturally by his sides. He motioned for us to follow, leading us toward the entrance of what looked like a crevasse carved into the fortress walls. But I couldn't move. Jaylene's hand tightened around mine, and I knew she felt it too. This instinct telling us not to go inside. I kept the engine running, the hum of the car grounding me. The man disappeared into the shadows, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him reappear. He didn't walk back. He was just there, standing at the edge of the wall, his limbs spread out, too stiff, too unnatural. His head tilted, eyes wide but empty, locking onto us in that same blank stare. Neither of us waited. I floored it. The tires screeched again as we shot forward, speeding down the road, the fortress falling away behind us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing us, but he wasn't. He was just standing there, arms and legs outstretched, his body frozen in that same uncanny pose, watching us as we disappeared into the dark. The road stretched on, nearly invisible except for the faint purple glow of the streetlights above. The world around us was quiet, too quiet. Jaylene was silent beside me, her face pale in the dim light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that nothing escaped from this place. Let me know what you think. As the mirror cracked, the reflection twisted, revealing another world where the horrors were just beginning. My friend's been missing for 10 years. I think I found him. Hi, my name's Simon, and I don't believe in the supernatural. I've never been spiritual or anything like that. I don't care if someone else holds those beliefs, but it's just never penetrated my human experience. It's always felt like the world is a flow of motion, and one day, your motion just stops. I think my friend is still alive up there. Maybe he's become mentally ill from being up there so long, I don't really know. I felt really hesitant even making this post, but there's not a lot of options, I guess. I'll start from the beginning. I will not disclose any specific details, but I live in the Northwest. My family and I moved up here from New Mexico when I was only 5 years old. It couldn't have been better for me. I found my love of nature, hiking, hunting, and fishing. All things that weren't a huge attraction back home. The massive trees and the river systems carving their ways through the dense, rocky terrain. I love it up here. Even school wasn't too bad. It had its ups and downs, exes, bullies, fights, high school drama. But really, my life was good and fairly one note, until my friend went missing. 10 years ago, when we were in sophomore year, the class took a field trip to a nearby mountain range. It was a hiker's paradise out there. Beautiful, and lots of bald spots, so getting lost was much less likely. They even had a trail that went up to a pioneer's cabin. It was a really cute spot I'd visit in later years. My best friend's name was Clark. Our friendship began in junior year and prospered in high school, mostly because we had the same taste in music. Alt-rock. And yes, to all you metalheads, I did listen to Tool and some Machine Head. I branched out, but alt-rock is just what we landed on, so forgive me. It really felt like the glue that held us together was music. We talked on and on about the different bands we loved, argued to death on their worst albums. We were even discussing starting our own band, but alas, Valley Boys was not meant to be. I remember it all so vividly. Not just the moment, but all the little stuff leading up to it. All these years, and it still hasn't left me. Why hasn't it left me? On the bus ride, we were arguing about MCR's new compilation album, May Death Never Stop You. Both agreeing we were hoping for a whole new album, not some combination of a bunch of old hits. Clark said, yeah, I like the sound they have, but it's time they branched out. I was arguing, if you had a money winner like that, why would you ever change it? He thought for a bit as the bus jostled. Because I have dignity. You'll have dignity in a cardboard box then, I chuckled. He bit back the smile that was starting to form on his face. So, Captain Shameless, have you talked to Julie yet? That was a sore spot back then. Okay, I still have trouble, but not nearly as bad as then. I had a streak for being absolutely petrified of women. Every time I got close, I would sweat and forget how to string together a coherent sentence. Clark, on the other hand, was a smooth operator. Well, that's what I thought in high school. Looking back, he may have just figured out that confidence was key much earlier than most of us. I'll do it on this trip, I said much too confidently. I blew the long strands of brown hair out of my face. Oh, she's right over there. I darted my eyes over to the seat behind us, where 2 boys sat. Dick, I slapped him with my red baseball cap. I looked down and noticed that Clark was wearing a Metallica shirt. Uncharacteristic of his usual tastes, however, it fit his dark visage. Shaggy black hair, brown eyes, tall. Traitor, I thought. He looked down at his shirt, then me, and smirked. I just think the album cover is cool. Chill out, Simon. We settled into our normal talks, but I could see something was distracting him. I should have asked him. I just should have asked him. Clark wasn't easily distracted. He lived in the moment, I lived in my head. That's how we worked. But it wasn't working that day. What was he thinking about? God, what was he thinking about? The bus bounced and hopped through the little valley town, up and through to the destination. It was miles of fields, and I thought maybe I wouldn't mind living there. But how could I be a famous musician and a mountain man? Seemed those things did not mix. Humans like to put things into neat little boxes. The contents all have to make sense. If you start mixing them, people get confused. When you're confused, you feel stupid. Nobody likes to feel stupid. So people will spill out the contents of themselves just to stuff it with something more organized. Nobody except Clark knew I hunted. I loved camping on the weekends. Nature was my getaway. Music was the art I listened to away from the noise of buildings and cities. The bus rose up, dragging itself up the black asphalt road until we parked in that little dirt lot, signs and boulders outlining where we would begin our trek. I kept appearances with a Pearl Jam shirt and some torn jeans, but I wasn't dumb enough to bring sneakers on a 2-hour hike. I made sure Clark didn't make the mistake either. He tied them like bunny ears instead of cross-hatching, which annoyed me beyond measure. I looked over the woods. Browns were more of the state than greens. Dry dirt that rose into bark that struck odd shapes into trees. I could see animals and screaming faces carved into the surface. Those woods were a drawing siren inside a sea of green and brown. Kids spilled out laughing and joking. I saw lots of sneakers. Our teacher was Mr. Drytouth. People called him Dry Mouth because he was old and rasped out words. Our decrepit protector said, "All right, children, we're going to be hiking," as though the sign wasn't right in front of us. Naturally, being such a closeted hiker, I did my research on the trail. I knew the place was already a mistake. According to all the sources I could find, it was considered a severe hike. Almost 20 kilometers total. Obviously, he didn't plan to take us the whole way, but even a quarter of the way was too much for a bunch of sophomore kids. I joked with Clark that all the pretty sneakers would have puke on them by the end. He didn't laugh. He instead stared wistfully at the trail. I ignored his silence and eyed the perimeter of the parking lot. A few other cars parked there. A beat-up old red Chevy, a gray Tundra, and an old yellow Corvette. Me and my infinite paranoia was wondering what kind of people would be hiking the severe trail. We started on our ascent. I remember that the sun was hot as fuck that day. It was suffocating. I brought a big water jug and was glad of it. The trail radiated heat. Crawling through the ass crack of 2 mountains pressed together. Trees started to press closer like they were trying to lull us deeper into the thick embrace of Mother Nature. I really can't say if it's the context of what happened or if I really felt like it at the time. But it felt awful out there, like I was a wounded animal going off to perish somewhere alone. I handed the jug over to Clark, making sure he took a big gulp. I looked up and saw Julie lagging behind. "All right, cowboy, now's your chance," he jabbed. "You've got a sweat stain on your ass." Clark whipped around, and before he realized my ruse, I half fell towards Julie. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah. So sweaty out here, right?" "What?" "The sun. It's sunny." "Yeah?" I ran back to Clark before I could suffer the burning gaze of her any longer. I was shaking, my whole body trembling as if ready to receive a beating. "What happened?" he asked. From the shame on my face, he knew to drop it, to just let that interaction fall to the ground and melt in the hot sun. Clark started tapping his leg rhythmically, staring out around the outcropping our class found ourselves on. There were steep hills to either side, bare of most trees. We passed a large boulder when I noticed Clark's incessant tapping. Thinking a new song up? He looked over and smiled weakly. "It's been coming together." "Any actual guitar playing?" I said. "I've been thinking piano, actually." "Really?" "Yes, Simon. A piano. Pianos have a lot of range. The range at which it will keep you from women is an impressive distance." He laughed at that and people turned around to look. I would have been embarrassed if my head wasn't so full of heat. Sweat lingering in my vision as we walked through another cropping of trees. We had been hiking for an hour when finally one of the girls began to sway. One of her friends caught her and looking around realized there was no one to tell. Mr. Drymouth was gone. I guessed he had fallen behind. Some of the kids too mature for their age suggested we hike back down towards him, and if we can't find him, to notify the bus driver. An actual, level-headed plan I could get behind. We began the awkward hot descent. Some of the other students began to grow nauseous. I didn't blame them. It was much too hot for a hike like that. I had no idea what the teacher had thought bringing us out there. Clark seemed especially bothered. I looked over to him. "Hey man, water? You can have the last drink." I sloshed the nectar around to drive home the point. I can't hear very well," he muttered. I'd never heard of a symptom like that for heat stroke. Maybe confusion. I told him we were halfway down the trail. Julie apparently heard me. "How do you know that, Simon?" she said with a tinge of annoyance. "Heat will do that." Oh, I remember this bend comes after the boulder we just passed, which was about halfway up. Jesus, you have a good sense of direction, she said. I blushed before saying, "I have hiking boots." "What?" she said. The confusion was not caused by heat stroke. Clark turned. I see that face in distant flashes when I daydream. Sometimes when that personality that had been so integral to a younger me wanders back into perception. I see his face, aghast, morbid realization maybe, but all his face told me was something was unimaginably wrong. So wrong. I feel sick now just thinking about what he said, just putting it into reality. "Something happened to Mr. Dretooth," he said. I was completely perplexed by the oddity, a random mention as though gifted knowledge not known to me. It was alien. What? He shook his head as if erasing confusion from his heat-rattled head. Nobody else heard my friend. Right now, I'm thinking, why the fuck did he bring us out there that day? That fucking idiot. Even typing it gets me so pissed. He should be held responsible. He should have been held more responsible, I should be saying. Maybe I'd still be joking about musical instruments with Clark today. But not today. Or yesterday. Not for a long time. This heat is bad, Simon. You don't understand. He waved me off as if trying to wave off an apparition. I pressed him to tell me what he meant. That's when the girl passed out. She fell right on the ground in a heap. Panic began to ensue. A class of sophomore kids up on a heat-ridden mountain lost composure. Those more mature kids ran over to her quickly, opening her eyelids, feeling her neck for a pulse. I was frozen for a moment watching it happen. I told myself the thing that every man thinks. They have enough people. They don't need me to help. Diffusing responsibility. They picked her up, and I turned to Clark, about to ask him if we should do something. Like smoke, he had been next to me. Then he wasn't. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't told me anything, had existed one moment, then the world swallowed him into its deepest, darkest pits. The forest was so quiet. I remembered everyone faded into the background. Someone attached to you at the hip is suddenly out of your awareness. I wonder how to describe that. Even now, even after counseling, even after soul-searching, there are things that fail to be interpreted by language, only apparent through sensation. Someone was in my life, then they weren't. All in 10 seconds. I should have just kept looking at him. He couldn't have ran off? Anyways, all I thought at the time was, where is he going? Sadly, my naivety didn't wear off the first hour down, nor the second. All the way to the bus stop, it didn't stop. Oh, he must be taking a piss up there. He'll be down. Oh, he must be lost. We'll find him. He must have bedded down for the night. The Rangers will get him. Then he'll come down. My friend is alive. I know it. Days after, hope still remained. When we arrived at the bus stop, Mr. Drytouth was being taken care of by the bus driver. I asked if Clark had been there. There was no reply. I asked if they would come help look. The bus driver could not leave everyone unattended. "Can I go?" I asked. "No, we don't need anyone else unaccounted for." We waited an hour until they notified Rangers. There was nothing we could do. Drytouth was rambling. He was in no state to go look. He looked sick, and not just from the heat stroke. As the sun touched the tip of those mountains and the brights came on, the lights of the Rangers at V's worming their way up the mountain, it gave me the thought of uniformity failure. I watched, and maybe subconsciously I understood that no one was going to find him. That they were being careful instead of fast. That they were planning instead of doing. Maybe that's why I yelled at Mr. Drytouth. "Why the fuck did you bring us up there?" Everyone jumped. I was not the outspoken sort for reasons made clear earlier. The teacher couldn't even respond. Not until he said, "Thank you." I tensed with deep, pained anger. Slowly, it shook off into a puddle of seething contempt. I stormed off towards the road and did my pacing. It was surreal. What was next? Going home. A place without someone who I had known since 8th grade. Who would push me out of my comfort zone? Who could I laugh with? I was completely taxed from that hellish hike. I wondered what was taking him so long. How could I accept that he was missing? But I did, because I was 15 years old, and afraid to keep him alive in my memory. Without Clark, I leaned much harder into my hiking background. I spent most of my time alone, not friendless, but no best friends. I became well acquainted with fish and game. Even local rangers became well acquainted with me. So it really just made sense when I eventually became a guide. Mostly for other hunters, but now and again for families trying to see some sights. I really opened up when I was out in nature, so talking was much easier. Something about being responsible for others made me feel obligated to know them. Most of them I was glad to know. The pay isn't great, but the job is. So that's what I've been doing the last 3 or so years. I make it a habit to explore new trails. 1, because they can net me new customers. And 2, I love hiking. I think I've explained this. But I avoided one trail, no matter how close to the trails I was acquainted with. Still haunted me. Every once in a while I'd have a dream about Clark looking at me silently, just standing all lonesome in that trail. So I avoided it like the plague. I kept on, until my girlfriend told me that I needed some exposure therapy. I fear she might be right. I am a strong believer in facing your fears, so the fact I let that path bother me for so long should showcase how fucking scared I was. But I went anyways. She offered to come with me, but I told her I didn't want her to see me cry. I played it off like a joke, but who knows how I'd feel up there. I drove my 2015 Wrangler up. I crested over a hill and down into that sunny little valley town I had seen all those years ago. People as polite as ever, waving me through as though I were family. I slowed the Jeep the closer I got to the trailhead. I stopped at the entrance to the parking lot. My limbs were shaking. I hadn't seen anyone die. I hadn't been attacked. So why was I shaking like a leaf? It made me so mad I floored the pedal and lurched into the parking lot with a jolt. I put the car in park and slapped myself once. Easiest hike of my life, I said, meeting my gaze in the rear view. I pressed the radio on until I got to the proper channel for weather alerts. I didn't hear anything, so I looked over to my little notepad list of the weather for the day. I'm going to write it down here, since I have it still. 12 p.m. Arrive at 2:75 F, there would be 5 miles per hour winds. At 3:80 F, no notable changes. At 4:82 F, 5% chance of rain. At 5:83, 10% chance of rain. Head back. I checked my watch and made sure it was working properly. I checked my bag for all of my essentials, including a map, PLB, water, MRE, hunting knife, metal bowl, fire starter, binoculars, and some snacks. Thorough. That was my motto. Also my Kimber K success. I brushed my hand through my cropped brown hair, stretched my wide shoulders. All the hunting and hiking had made my thick build just a little stronger, but all the snacks balanced me out with a little bit of a gut. I took a few steps towards the trail marker. I was overcome with that feeling of dread. Only one other vehicle was in the parking lot, an old red Chevy. I reflexively let my hand lay on my holster, just for a sense of safety. I swallowed and began to make my trek. The new hiking boots I had bought were sleek and comfortable. That hike would decide if they were my lucky boots, or if they were the shit boots. I made my way up. A slow, creeping sensation of fright scuttled its way up my legs. I stomped harder to try to shake the weakness spreading throughout my body. I forced myself to continue. I couldn't let that trail hold me. I had to be better than that. Soon there was some winds. I looked at my watch. 2:05 p.m. I nodded to myself. Coming to an outcropping, I sat on a tree stump and stared out at the valley and down below. A beautiful creek ran far below. Far, far below. My eyes stared and made out a figure crouched down at the edge of it. I looked over to my bag and got my binoculars out. I stared down into the valley and there was a man, in full fishing gear, looking quite worn. Definitely a bushman. He didn't look like he had left the forest for some years. He casting a net along the river, and I remarked that it was illegal. But pressing a poacher out in the middle of the bush was how people went missing. So I ignored it, standing up instead. I looked one more time at the man with the massive bushy beard. Damn, I thought. He had actually caught a fish. It flapped onto shore and the man stood on it. I was expecting him to just step on its head and kill it. He instead took his knife and began cutting its tail off. I groaned as he began to cut it back to front. The fish, still breathing. He would just sit there watching it. He'd cut up, then watch it twitch until the thing finally passed on to whatever fish god it belonged to. The man calmly washed his hands off before casting the net back out. All pieces of the fish just lay behind him on the bank, cooking in the sun. I left that spot, determining that the trail was clearly just cursed with weird shit. It honestly shook me. I wondered then if this was one of those creepy-ass towns where everyone is in on something not understood to the confused traveler. I loved those movies. Clouds rolled over the shining sun and suddenly the shade came to me. Not that I was complaining. Well, maybe complaining a little, thinking it might actually rain with only a supposed 5 to 10% chance. That's when I passed the large boulder. It was the one that marked the halfway point to where I had last seen Clark. It wasn't a 5-mile marker anymore, it was a gravestone of sorts. I rubbed my hand over my face, and when I closed my eyes I saw Clark in the darkness. I opened them, quickly slapping myself again and again. I rushed up the mountain, letting my irritation propel me further. I took out my drink and looked down at it, the life of my body contained in a little metal cylinder. I drank. I kept up, rethinking all the things I had explained earlier, of the past, that moment in my mind. Mr. Drytooth is in trouble, I said absent-mindedly. I looked up and saw the path forward was one I had not gone to before. I looked back and saw the quiet trees Clark had supposedly ran into. My skin tightened like a deer pelt over a drum. My heart thudded in my chest, and I was still. To move higher on the mountain was suicide. Every inch of my body was rigid. It would not let me go any farther. I have trouble regurgitating this information. It feels like I'm back again. I don't want to be back again. I looked up the hill, then looked back. A figure with long black hair and a band tee had their back turned to me as they walked back into the tree line. It was so nonchalant. It was over so quickly. I gripped my chest as my heart's normal rhythmic state trembled in awkward stiletto. "Hello," I said, not really knowing any other words. I walked back down, and there were footprints. Real footprints. I followed. Thoughts swam through my consciousness. Did he run away? Has he been lost this entire time? Am I hallucinating? A random person? I ran after the footprints. They disappeared into the tree line. I burst through, stopping just before a steep hill. I shook my head, realizing that the trail was obviously lost. "It's Clark. Where are you?" I yelled. My voice echoed in the empty valley, and I was left with nothing but hopelessness to fill the silence. It sounds stupid. It could be anyone, but I can't shake the fact that it felt like him. Even the strut was so oddly familiar. Everything about it. I couldn't climb any higher, so I hiked back down. I felt the odd sense of primal sickness, as though my ancestors were warning me of a predator very near. My skin crawled and my perception widened. I noticed it. Someone was out of breath. I looked back up the trail. The breathing became steadier as I stopped. I put my hand at my holster. "Hey, make yourself known," I said, trying to keep the tremble from my voice. The breathing turned into some kind of rasping. I tried to listen, but the wind picked up and rain trickled down. I thought my fears were very warranted in that moment. I pulled my gun out and began to walk down the trail, keeping an eye behind me. The noise faded into the fuzz of rain. I rounded a corner, and on the ground I saw Clark's band tee. My face contorted as if it was going to rip with the force of my expression. "Who are you? Come out, motherfucker. You know me," it said, so close to the nape of my neck that it felt like the voice had crawled up my spinal cord. I whipped around, cocking the hammer. No one. I turned back, and something metal struck my head. A dull, vibrating ring sounded, and I was down on the ground. I pawed for my gun, my sense of balance alien. I could see the figure with the dark, long hair digging through my pack in doubles. I yelled, rolling in awkward waves of pain. I mustered the last bit of sense I had, and yelled, tackling them, sending us into a muddy heap. We tumbled down the trail near one of the steeper ledges, and I held them down with my stocky build. I pulled the gun to their face, and suddenly my mind went white, like someone had wiped it clean of all experience. Sense of past, future, and present left me. Their visage had been completely masked, and I had been stunned. I woke up in the same spot, no one there. Rain pouring now. I clawed my way up that muddy bank, and there I found my pack. I stumbled down the mountain, a ghost looking for familiarity. I tried to find my truck in my damaged state. I looked over in the parking lot and saw an old red truck. The drive home was dangerous, to say the least. The whole experience shook me pretty bad, and I'm pretty upset with my girlfriend right now. She's insisting that it's a hallucination brought on by trauma. We've been arguing about it for the last few hours. She says the damage could have been me just rolling around. To that I would say, why is my hunting knife missing then? Why would I hallucinate so intensely that I would throw my own knife away as a trauma response? Makes no sense. Just like the dreams. I've been waking up screaming recently. I don't remember the dreams. I only remember phrases from within them. One that keeps coming back is bottom to top. My girlfriend wants to come with me next time to see with her own eyes how I am not hallucinating. The rain washed the scuffle away. The band tee is probably gone. And for obvious reasons, I wouldn't bring a 145 woman with me when there's a violent thing up on a mountaintop somewhere. But even if that all were not true, there's one more simple reason why I could never bring her. Something was unlocked on that mountain. I'm starting to remember why I'm so afraid of that mountain. My friend's been missing for 10 years. I think I found him. When you're younger, memories are like turbulent water that either bubble to the surface or are lost in the churn of new experiences. With the flooding of new information up on that mountain top, I quickly ascertained some strange qualities of the entire range. Specifically, I recall me and my father took a trip up to a peak only 5 or so miles away from. I know I'm stupid for not remembering. It was just one of those things that don't fit in the context of a child. Distance is indiscernible to a child. It was just an ethereal meadow and steep climb to the pioneer's cabin, still going to defend my forgetfulness. The drive from the two places is close to a couple hours, but on the actual map, their location is eerily close in proximity. I called my dad to make sure I was remembering right. He was quiet for some time. My usually bubbly and talkative dad brought a solemn soundlessness. "Why are you asking me about it?" he had asked. "I was thinking about the man at the cabin." Again, some quiet in between us. "Ah, you remember him then?" "In parts." In truth, I didn't. It only hit me with his next line. The memory. He sighed shakily. "Do you remember him speaking?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Don't go up there again, son." He gave his usual "I love yous" and then quickly ended the call. The strangeness of his tone set my nerves on edge. The memory replays even as I type this. The day was really great. I mean, really great. My dad was a nerdy techie who got bored of the city. That's why we had moved up to the northwest. He was tired of the arid desert areas of New Mexico. He wanted some mountains. He wanted something new. My dad's still a techie. He codes and makes the money. Never really been the biggest hunter. Thankfully, his new friends didn't mind taking me up with them. Hiking, camping, and fishing was more his beat in his free time. He taught me how to tie a fisherman's knot, how to set up a fire, and how to navigate. Always look behind when walking an unfamiliar path. So on the way back, it will make as much sense as going up. I still live by his words. I must have been at least 9 years old. We had planned a little camping trip for 2 weeks. We'd never been up the pioneer path. It felt like I was the one lacking enthusiasm with how ecstatic my father was. We started out early, stopping by the gas station. He smiled, he adjusted his thin-frame glasses, and rubbed his short brown hair. "Well, Mr. Lewisman, would you care to get a pizza pocket before the drive?" "Yes, sir, yes, sir." I kicked my little feet and jumped from the back seat. My Skechers lit up as I made contact with the concrete. My father walked up to the door and held it open as I excitedly launched myself into the place. Immediately, I found myself at the deli. An older woman with hoop earrings stared down at me. "You gonna pay for it?" She smiled. "No." "Yes, he is," my dad said. I reached into my pockets, and my father turned his back and whistled out loud, his hand outstretched behind him with a $10 bill. I ripped it from his hand so fast, you'd think he owed me the money. "One pizza pocket, yes, and please," I stated. The woman rolled her eyes, the smell of cigarettes wafting its way down to me. She went over to the counter and rung it up. $30, she said. My heart sank and sweat soaked into the $10 bill. I was had. It was a ruse. The money would not buy my way into pizza pocket heaven. Sorry, I'm joking, honey. Give me the 10. I shakily handed it off, and my dad slapped me on the back. My chest again swelled with childlike pride over my hard-earned money. 4 and 4 sores your change. I grabbed it, saying my thanks as I quickly ran to the door. My dad almost beat me there. I looked out at the pumps and saw a bunch of beat-up old trucks, blue, gray, red, black. We were on our way to the trip of a lifetime. We shook along the old highway that led to that sunny valley. Yellow lines waved off by time and the assault of ominous rays. Trees pressed closer and closer, tightening our path to the entrance. Dad filled the air with chatter, talking about how at work he had debugged an entire issue with global scope in his software. How new techies don't know how to simplify. My memory goes out there, for obvious reasons. Strange how the little details will stick, but the importance of the beginning leaves me. I don't remember the lot, or even the sign, but I remember the trees of autumn, of orange capturing what was the death of an entire forest. Clark would always comment that winter only loses to autumn because it's a pretty death instead of a quite one. Admittedly, it was some teenage angst now that I type it. The trees winded a fence-like path along the mountain. My dad and I crushed the large oak leaves as we went. Birch made its appearance further up. Beautiful white bark with plenty of lovebirds carving their mark in the soft wood. I stumbled my awkward little body up the pathway, taking care to smell that forest scent. The silence that is the ambient breathing of the world. My pack was much too large for me, and a quarter way up, little old me gave it to my poor father. I was looking at my shoes. Yes, that's what it was. My little light-up shoes. The world began to seem like a distant memory. Sensation became nothing but incorporeal chatter outside of my reality. Something in the air had shifted. The feeling that my own tension had been hijacked by an alternate source. I peered to the right set of brush, scattered birch trees that seemed to be moving ever so slightly to show me the new way up the mountain. It was the right way. I walked. A heavy hand grabbed my puffy coat. "Simon," my dad barked. "Don't go running off the path. I'm serious." I nodded dizzily. "You know my rules on these things. Here I'll tell you more coding stories to take your mind off it." If I couldn't sleepwalk before, I could after that statement. The feeling still crawled along the hairs standing up on my arms. For a moment, I was somewhere else. Thinking back, I honestly just thought it was a weird childlike fascination with the forest. Adventurous attitude. But the bias inside the strangeness of recent events has tainted every last memory of that mountain range, somber and ominous. The trees soon slowly shuffled away, the mountain bidding itself welcome. Balding Peak, reminiscent of... I couldn't quite make out the cabin right then, but it motivated me to climb. Dad could hardly keep up. Well, to be fair to him, he was packing my stuff as well. I trudged up the mountain with no regard for my beleaguered pack mule. My little shoes sparkling in my sprint. God, it's making me wince. Light up Skechers on a camping trip. Maybe I've got to remember to give 9-year-old me the benefit of the doubt. Never liked kids. It's a topic of hot debate with my girlfriend. We had finally arrived there. That cabin. An empty field lay behind it, rising into a great tidal wave of grass. Below, awash with the forest crashing against the proverbial shore. That cabin, the ship. I ran up to the little wooden steps and barged in. Lucky to find I hadn't stumbled on some hippies making memories. The sunset behind me bathed the room in orange light. Dark wood walls, with names and dates scrawled all over them. 2 sets of shelving people used for bunking. I jumped, and a spot right in front of the doorway made a sound like it might give way. I was suddenly a little less enthused. Dad finally arrived, dumping the stuff next to the wall of words. We stared in mute appreciation of the mural. Giant ones that said Taby, Josh Wolfus, and a beautiful sunflower. Okay, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The sunflower painter wasn't some art major, but it was nice. My eyes traced over the outer edges as if redrawing the thing in my mind's eye, until it was here now. In the part of your brain that recalls the things you will see again when you die. Night set in, and my dad pulled a lamp from his overpacked bag. He pinched his shirt and cleaned his rectangular glasses off. He put the lamp down, and we laughed about how long it took us to get there. "You know, your mom and I have been thinking about moving back down to New Mexico." No. He put a hand up to silence me, a smirk playing on his face. "I'm just joking. So you like it here, truly?" "Yeah, I love fishing and hunting and running and hiking and camping and..." Hand up again. "So what's going on at school, bud?" That brought an air of silence to my chatty 9-year-old self. A ball of shame climbed its way to my throat and sat there. Until middle school, I hadn't made a single friend. Kids could sense the nature of my presence. It was a thing that enjoyed solitude and observation. They allowed me to do both. I wasn't great at the talking thing. I enjoyed being silent with people I liked, not something children are accustomed to. Not even sure adults can handle healthy silence. Nobody acknowledged my existence. I almost wished someone would pick on me, just so I could have had an excuse to talk to someone in my grade. I learned an adult emotion at a juvenile age: apathy. The kids are no fun here. That's why I like the woods, I said, my hand retrieving a pocket knife from my bag, a most prized possession. A curvy silver handle with a fat drop-point blade, a hunting knife. I waddled over to the wall as Dad continued his questioning. Why are they no fun? Because they won't sit next to me, I thought, because they're all doing kid stuff. Kid stuff? Yeah, like they play with Legos. I go on cool hikes. I know plenty of the other kids go out with their dads, fishing and stuff. What's really going on, Simon? I started carving my name into the wall. I'm there. Oh, and just a bunch of LEWISMAN assholes. I finished. I turned and realized what I had said. My face turned red and burning heat came over me. My dad gave me a knowing look. A small smile touched his face. Don't say that again. Also, don't tell your mother I let you get away with that out here. I grinned. What happens at the cabin stays at the cabin, he stated. We began our dinner. A little propane stove he used to make us some grilled cheese. I sat patiently waiting for the gourmet delicacy to cook. That's when the knock came. I looked at my father in search of a reason to be afraid. A look like a deer when it hears a twig snap tore its way across my dad's face. My dad put his hand on his waistband where his knife was. He wasn't a big fan of guns. Unless they were used for hunting, he didn't bring them. He walked up to the door and cracked it. There were some murmurs at the door. My dad chuckled and let the door swing open. A man stood in the darkness of the outdoors, some kind of vest on, strings hanging out of the pockets, a round hat that covered his face. It smelled like lake water the minute that door opened. Ah, so you're down by the river then? I was wondering if anyone was staying up here. Just my son and I. Sorry to say the cabin's taken. That right? My dad's back tensed a little bit. The man glanced over at me. He must have yelled because of how close it sounded. Remember the music, boy. I just cocked my head and stared. My dad's voice raised. What are you doing? Get out of the doorway. The man just stared past his shoulder without acknowledging him anymore. Stop staring at my fucking kid. My dad put his arm up in front of him. I was entranced in something I can no longer remember. Say something, you fucking creep, my dad said, pressing the man through the gap in the doorway. But Dad, he did say something, I said, cocking my head. My dad's head turned to look at me. The way I can describe his expression was pure unadulterated fear. Like he was suddenly looking at me through a distorted lens. You guys got a nice little Honda. Roads will be slick after the storm. Wait till sunlight, he said, more muffled. Dad said something quietly, but it was stern and had a hint of rage to it. The man waved a big calloused hand and plodded back down the steps. The minute he stepped down those wooden things, it was as though his walk turned into air. Silence. My dad stared at the lamp. He began to pack when we heard the thunder. The sky was threatening to crack open. My father's face winced, color gone from it. He gripped his hair as if he were trying to keep his skull in place. Fuck. Dad. Be quiet, he said simply. I leaned back against the ground. I looked at the wall and saw a single word carved into the wall. One I didn't think was there before. Allah. This shakes me deeply now. Why did those words not occur to me before? The second was obviously the mountain we took the trip on. But Puha is still kinda strange to me. I am familiar with a thistle, sometimes referred to as that. I looked it up, and possibly it has some, Hawaiian dictionary stuff. I'm honestly lost. Let me know if you guys know anything, please. The rest of that night was mostly my dad standing at any noise around the cabin. I slept just fine through the storm. When I woke up, I couldn't say the same about Dad. His techie face was etched in stone, and he looked more like an Idaho father than I'd ever seen him look. Let's go, was all he said. I looked towards my items that had been scattered, already packed into my bag haphazardly. He grabbed my hand, and before my legs were awake, we were trudging down the muddy field. It really had been a bad storm that night. He was determined to get us down quickly. I suddenly felt as though we were being hunted by something. My father pulled me close to him and looked in every direction with a discerning eye, even me. Halfway down, Dad found signs of fresh human footprints, but no one had passed us. His hand gripped that sheath at his side. I didn't dare speak a word to him. "Hurry up, Simon. We're going home." Sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. We moved our way farther and farther down, sliding and falling until the car lot came into view. I saw my dad's eyes soften a little. I came over to the back seat. Before Dad had unlocked the vehicle, I pulled the back door open. He didn't notice as he flung himself into the driver's seat. My seat was wet, but the windows were rolled up. I knew he would kill me if he thought I left the window open, so I didn't say anything. Just put my coat down in my seat and sat down. He started up the car and tore out of there. He apologized on the way back, but his eyes held a hint of apprehension towards me, like he'd seen his son differently. He's kept that all these years. That's why I feel strange about it. Just that little pane of glass between a father and a son. I'm sorry about that little story I remembered, but it's been turning in my head since my little trip up Hinman. Theories have been forming. The possibility that a creep lived up in that mountain range seems more plausible now. Multiple, even with how many footprints were up there. The fact he had possibly stayed in our fucking vehicle makes me think that he only lives out in that cabin, sleeping in whatever he can find when it's occupied. Which made me consider, what if that's where Clark is buried? Up by that cabin? That would mean I'm accepting it wasn't really him up on that mountain, but that is hard to accept. It's beyond hard to. Obviously, however, what it was meant me harm, but Clark wouldn't mean me any harm. It doesn't make any sense. One thing is clear now that I think about it. The sensation of that man in the doorway asking me that question feels exactly how the thing on the mountain speaking sounded. You know me. I know them? These are all just loose threads I'm trying to piece together here. I'm planning on going back to Pioneer's cabin very soon. I also wanted to thank Wolf D. Cody. He brought up that the truck I had seen going up the day Clark disappeared could have been the same one I saw a couple months ago. I want to reiterate that it's a little too difficult to tell, but now I'll be on the lookout for a red beat-up Chevy. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. I'll let you all know what happens up at Pioneer's cabin. I've been busy trying to work in between these little excursions. I just got back from a guiding expedition with some wildlife photographers. That's a story for another day. Anyways, I've been distancing myself from Stacy lately. That's my girlfriend, by the way. Not my real name, obviously. This has led to a rift between us that at first was uncomfortable, something I tried to mend, but now I see it's given me more time to follow this rabbit hole. The nexus point of all my life, a gravitational pull I cannot escape, a whirlpool that will drag me down until I get to the bottom of it. I will know what happened to Clark, even if I have to cut every person off to do it. I've come to peace with that. One more thing to mention. My door was unlocked when I got home last night. Stacy and I are paranoid people. We don't leave doors unlocked. Never. My friend's been missing for 10 years. I think I found him. Part 3. I've lost track of time. Consciousness is slipping in and out of focus for me. Lapses in purposeful thought are escaping me like a fly in the dark. I miss the months of old where I lived in quiet background trauma. I'd rather a lost friend than a lost mind. Maybe that's selfish. I think I'm selfish. I went to the cabin. Maybe it was last night, maybe it was days ago, I couldn't really tell you. I remembered that I had planned to take some hunters up a drawl a city over. I'm sure they're rightly pissed I never called back. I thought hurrying up there, I could get down before sunset, get home, then head to the city in the morning. I was wrong. When I pulled into that parking lot, suddenly I was faced with how similar that place still looked. The dead leaves colored orange, brown, and red layered the ground in a mural of beautiful fall. I felt like a kid again, hopping out of the Jeep. I grabbed my revolver, a compass, my phone, a small hunting knife, and the Pelby. I checked my bag and found the fire starter, a small headlamp and map of the area. I didn't have time for any snacks or anything. The trail mix was a casualty of war for that trip. I looked up at the sky, and the sun told me it was giving me 2 hours max. I trudged up through the entrance, passing the sign, a picture posted of the little cabin I'd be exploring. What was I even looking for up there? Your guess was as good as mine. My hiking boots were finally broken in. They had slowly become my unlucky pair with this odyssey I had taken upon myself. I was searching for answers. The man with the red Chevy, the fisherman, When I thought about the fisherman, it came back to me. That man at the bank, my first trip back on. A fisherman, and the way he cut the fish. Those connections began to make waves in my mind, and I couldn't help but look behind me. Of course, there was nothing but a cool breeze flipping over the trail's loose debris. I continued, racing up the mountain towards my destination. I cleared the trees and looked up to the tsunami of grass that laid ahead. The meadow was slowly dying. With every step, I felt the tension in my legs and hands double. That lone cabin quickly being consumed by the darkness of the sky. I had to make it there. Something told me more than anything I had to be in there. I raced up to the steps and launched through the door. Taking care to step over the weak spot near the entrance, my eyes shot back up. No one. I quickly closed the door behind me as the last embers of daytime snuffed out. I sat down in a heap on the floor. I grabbed my headlamp and clicked it on. It had 8 hours of life, so I wasn't worried about it dying on me. I caught my breath for a few minutes, then cursed myself for my panicked running. I always kept my cool in the woods. I'd been trapped out in the night plenty of times and never reacted like that. What the hell was that? Writing this now, I know it was instinct. I know the primal part of my brain was more than correct in making me run. I moved my head up, the beam following my gaze. I lazily moved my head around the cabin walls looking for my name. New drawings, an old guitar, new lovers, and old scrawled across the oak. My eyes finally met with my quarry. I saw it on the back wall, along with a bunch of new graffiti tagged alongside it. Simon Lewisman. I chuckled at the rough carving, nostalgia dulling the senses. Before my head moved down, bringing the light to fall on a carving right below it. Clark Coates. This writing was almost mechanical, like a stamp. This wasn't Clark's messy handwriting. I balled my hand into a fist and pounded the wall. What the fuck happened to you, Clark? I knew right then that was a gravestone. It might as well have said, "Here lies." I just knew right then, like I'd always known, that he was gone for good. My PLB crackled and I took it off my belt. I hit the thing a couple times and it sounded like a little tune of some sort came through. I knew the melody but couldn't place the song. I hit it again and it stopped. I sat in silence for a moment. I assumed it was some kind of interference from a station. But it shouldn't be on that channel anyways, but again, it's not impossible. What came next was 3 knocks, evenly spaced out and calm. I dropped the PLB when that noise came. Staring at the door, my hand landed on the revolver. I picked up the PLB, not taking my eyes off the door. There's someone here. You're going to have to find another place. There was a beat of silence filled with the sound of blood pounding in my ears. I coiled like a spring, ready to launch at any sign of entry. "Simon, it's me." My father's voice. That was the last thing I had expected to hear. I got up, half stumbling to the door. I opened it, and in the bright beam of my headlamp lay my father. Looking rather youthful in the white light, he stood there in some hiking gear. The smell of a sweaty trek was all about him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I knew you were coming up, so I decided to meet you. I was hoping that I'd catch you before you took off." "Yeah, come in." I opened the door for him, and he stepped in. I closed the door quickly, as if all the horrors of the world would rush in if I left it open a second more. It was surreal. I'm suddenly placed into that time and space. My mind, rattled by the carving on the cabin, was now background noise to his disturbance. He sat down and produced a small metal lamp. "That thing looks ancient. Where's your electric one?" "Well, the other one died on me, so borrowed this one from a friend." I sat down, studying the walls alight with the orange color spilling from the lamp. "Well, smart of you. Your hiking-obsessed son forgot to bring a lamp." He smiled at that. So young in that lighting. So young. I saw my father like that, and it made me think about how I was going to be the age he was when he had me. How strange it was to repeat everything that had ever happened over and over. "What are you doing up here, Simon?" The question didn't come as a surprise, but the answers came with difficulty. "Clark, Dad, I know he's been killed." "Well, of course, he hasn't shown back up in 10 odd years," he replied. I guess the years of living in the Northwest had given him a little bit of a drawl. I know, but it's all so odd. I can't put it down. Some man attacked me dressed like him. I mean, wearing his hair like him, wearing his old t-shirt. It was so strange. Why didn't you tell me? He pressed. I looked down. I didn't want you to think I was crazy. You're not crazy, son. I think you're in your rightness. Damn right I am. What the fuck is going on with this mountain range? It's not right. I swung my arm and knocked over the little lantern. Ah, shit, sorry, Dad. Let me fix that. I reached out into the dark, my beam locating the metal lamp. I thought about how my dad enjoyed tech, how he always got the newest stuff. I went to turn it on as he spoke. This range has been here a long time. It eats up travelers. That peak, the hungriest of all. But it has a specific taste, son. I twisted the valve on the lamp to light it, but I turned first at the strangeness of his speech. My father was holding a syringe inching towards me, his youthful feature sharp and sinister in tone. I swung the lamp hard into his hand. Dad. He launched up towards me, and I was in a fight for my life. His thin limbs had a strength and dexterity unbefitting of a computer tech. His hands grasped my neck, and in that moment, I knew he could kill me. Air seeping from me, a scarier thought entered my oxygen-starved brain. He doesn't want to kill me. My fingertips grazed the handle of the oil lamp and swung it into his face. Stunned long enough for me to grab the syringe, I stabbed the thing deep in his chest, draining the liquid. He gasped, and I cried out a deep groan of regret. My father was stabbed in the chest. I had done it. I stumbled from the cabin and began running as I heard him coughing and sputtering. This is where time begins to slip away in my mind. I was running, and running. Sometimes downhill, sometimes up in the darkness. The beam of my headlamp always guiding me to some other patch of God-forsaken forest. Eventually I was walking, just so tired from the hike, I must have been completely lost. I heard voices sprouting up from the deep abyss of unfamiliar wood. Simon, come back. Father. Hey, I think he's over here. Simon, your girlfriend got worried. Are you out here? Some rescuer? No, there's no way she sent someone. Not that soon. I forced my legs to move, and next thing I remember, I was crawling on all fours from the parking lot entrance to my Jeep door. My clothes were half torn. My hands were rubbed half raw and bloody from the distance I must have crawled on them. I fumbled with my keys, the world filled with the sound of the metal things being shoved into the car door handle. Everything else was silent. Driving comes back in and out of memory. I know I was driving erratically. I know the road only led one way. But every time I blinked, I'd be driving my way back towards the lot. Once I was even up the path, before I realized where I was. I stomped on the gas, forcing my eyes open, and didn't let them close the 10 minutes I needed to get away from there. I was home free once I hit the highway. I could just feel it. The sun lit the road as early hours crept across the hood of my Jeep. Looking over at my headlamp, it blinked a couple times before dying. I realized then, I had been hiking and driving for 8 hours. I got home and it was a fight the minute I got home. Where have you been? Why are your hands bloody? Why do you look so tired? I just walked upstairs and locked the door. No matter how much banging on that door, I wouldn't open it. I didn't know where to even begin, and when her car pulled out of the driveway, I was happier for it. No one should have to live through what I was beginning to entrench myself into. I'm home right now. I don't know my next steps. But looking at the time and date, I must have lost track again. I was supposed to go up to the cabin a couple nights after my last post. My post says 8 days ago. God help me. I sleep when I don't mean to. I keep unlocking the window. My dad just texted. As the clock struck midnight, the hands turned, marking the end of one nightmare and the start of another. The last message, I never really believed in paranormal things or anything like that. I'm the kind of person who would be the last to believe in such things. But what happened that night changed everything. It was around 10 p.m. I was comfortably settled on the couch, watching a series on Netflix. The soft light from the screen illuminated the room, while the silence of the house was broken only by the characters' voices. My phone was beside me when it suddenly vibrated. Instinctively, I picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number, a number that definitely wasn't in my contacts. Curiosity took over. When I opened the conversation, A wave of dread washed over me. You are being watched. I tried to convince myself it was just my friends playing a prank, but the idea quickly faded when another message arrived. Look out the window. I thought about ignoring it. It was just some random number, and the idea of looking outside felt absurdly risky. But a strange sensation, like a voice inside urging me to act, led me to rise. The night was dark, and I could see nothing beyond the shadows of my own bushes. Another message. Now you don't see. Anxiety settled in my chest. I replied, almost pleading, "What do you want from me?" A quick response came, "Leave me alone." The tension escalated, as if the atmosphere around me were thickening. Then the next message made me freeze. "Come to the back door." My heart raced. Reluctantly, I walked to the back, the feeling of being watched growing with each step. I sent a message. "I'm here." The silence was deafening. With a courage I didn't know I had, I opened the door. My backyard was well lit, but darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. The air felt heavy, and there was a sweet, almost nauseating smell that made me uneasy. "Now you see," the message echoed in my mind. I looked into the darkness. At first, nothing. But then, something caught my eye in the bushes. I put on my glasses, trying to see better. What I saw made my blood run cold. A humanoid figure, distorted and shadowy, was there, watching me. Its eyes were not eyes at all, but deep voids that seemed to absorb the light. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and before I could react, the figure sprinted toward me. I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately, my heart pounding wildly. The thing banged on the door with a tremendous force, a sound echoing as if it were testing the house's resistance. Silence. I called the police while making sure all the windows were secure. I peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The darkness now felt denser, as if it were alive. The police arrived, but found nothing. Relief mixed with confusion made no sense. After they left, I couldn't sleep. What was that thing? What did it want? The messages continued to echo in my mind, like a constant whisper reminding me that I wasn't alone. The next day I received another message, this one without warning. "You thought you were free?" The moment of peace I longed for never came. Days dragged on, and the messages kept coming. Sometimes they were just unsettling words, "I am close," or "You cannot escape." But other times they were distorted images, as if someone were trying to show me the very essence of terror. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed to find out what was happening. I started researching stories of hauntings, abductions, and strange sightings. I discovered accounts of people who had encountered similar figures, beings that seemed to feed off fear, hiding in the shadows, always watching, and always waiting. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone vibrated again. It was a message. "You still don't understand." The air felt heavier, and the temperature dropped abruptly. A sense of despair overwhelmed me. I went to the window and looked outside. The darkness seemed to pulse as if it were alive. And then I saw it, the figure now closer, clearer. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a grotesque creature, with scaly skin and eyes that looked like two deep holes, empty and full of malice. The creature smiled, and I realized that the true terror was just beginning. In the back of my mind, a voice whispered, "You should never have looked." I came to Reddit to seek help and advice on what to do. I can't sleep, with that feeling of being watched. That sinister smile is still in my head. If anyone has encountered that thing and managed to survive, please help me. A cold chill crept down their spine, not because the terror had ended, but because a far worse horror was yet to unfold. The Boiler Room Forest Stream. I have failed as a therapist, but not as much as I have failed as a person. I let it happen. A psychosis had taken over me. An excuse that could be, right? I could blame my mental state. I could say I was depressed, and that would take the fall for me. It's worked for other people. Would it work for me? I don't know. As I write my recollection thoroughly, my fingers cramping from all the clicking and clacking, a small tear forms from my eye. It moistens my dry skin, sliding down slowly, eventually grazing my neck just barely. This madness, the one I let happen, I am responsible. When Alice followed the white rabbit, was she insane? No, she was just curious. When Alice drank from the mysterious bottles, was she crazy? No, she was desperate to find a way out. Madness, yes, madness surrounds my guilty conscience. A thunder shrinking and enlarging at will. A constant presence, never at a distance. always present, never to let me forget. I was wearing shoddy work boots, sliding through the snow with ease as I walked alone on a pitch-black night. My breathing was rough, frost forming in the air as I struggled to breathe. You couldn't see my face if you tried. It was covered in a thick scarf and parka. A lone waltz to nowhere important. Just my house, my normal, bland house. The moon hung high, so pale that it was barely there. If the moon was a person, they'd be dead. But their death wouldn't be quick. A slow decay of a body for all the world to see. A sight to behold, a true sight to see, but it is the horror I see when I close my eyes. My face in a mirror is enough to make my stomach churn. I can no longer make eye contact, even with myself. I can't remember what happened next. In one theory, I made it back safely without anything going on. In another, I was dragged back. All I knew was 1 minute I was shoddily awake, trudging through the snow. The next, I was in my bed. I don't think I would want to know how I made it back. It's basically non-important. The next day was standard enough. I went to work at my town's hospital. Due to the town being only 700 people, our hospital just housed all the necessary medical stuff in one building. I sat in my chair taking notes in my notebook. The pen danced writing each word that was needed. I was treating a young man, Colin Bedlam, an average-looking young man in his late teens. He had long, bushy brown hair. He was wearing his coat, a parka that hides his figure. Although, even with it, I could tell he doesn't eat enough. Colin spoke gently, calm as ever. Same thoughts as before, same ideas. Any weapons in particular? I inquired. Colin jostled around in his seat, slightly uncomfortable, and passive-aggressively he answered, "Not important." Harkening back to our previous sessions, I figured I knew what these thoughts were about. And these thoughts of violence, are they still related to thoughts of sex? That's a tough question. Colin laughed and paced in his chair. Whatever happened, it was like the angle changed with what he said next. Sex is a weird thing to discuss, no? What makes one fantasy worse than another? I think that a lot of people like violence sexually, and in an awful world, a bad, bad world. Bad people are born, through violent sex. Wicked sex makes wicked types. He recoiled, though he was righteous and hopeful. He hoped that he wasn't the only one, that he wasn't an outcast. Breathing slow, his voice steady and well-spoken, I believe that most people are capable of murder. It's mostly because they choose not to, that they are more virtuous than most claim. Like they are bound by a responsibility, a covenant, now neglected, and that would make murder an absurd sport of self-destruction. Curious, I wanted more of an explanation. Can you elaborate? It's hard. Most people don't realize they are murderers, so they might try to escape the label by claiming self-defense, or by claiming that they can't help themselves. He put his hand over his heart. Now, to be frank, I believe all men to be murderers. That's the only thing that keeps us going. It's sort of a survival instinct. That's all we have to survive. There's nothing else to live for. Again, it was like the angle changed. And what about your parents? Do you get along with your parents? Colin's face flipped from a nonchalant teen to a bitter man in an instant. Not the best relationship. My father, he works too much. My mother can get rather angry if I talk back to her, so she's not always here for me. That can be hell, Colin. I understand what it's like. Colin grew curious in a judgmental way. What do you mean by hell? I couldn't answer him, at least in a way that didn't make the situation worse. Our therapy session ended pretty shortly after that. At midnight, I was in my bed, naked. I was the only one in there, but it was almost like there was no life, an almost empty bedroom. I felt something slowly coming in the shadows. The windows reflected the moon's light, but it wasn't enough light. In the darkness, there was something beckoning me to it. In an almost trance-like state, I got out of bed, still naked, exiting the room, walking down the stairs. The shadow guided me like the Pied Piper to my mini library. Surrounding the bookcases, in the middle, was a painting of the landscape of hell. With a huge fire using bright colors, I stood and looked at it. As if separated from my old love, I approached the fire. Then, a succession of vocal strings moving in and out of music. Animals cry. There is no reason why. Then another sound, much closer, the scraping of something like nails on a chalkboard. I looked away from the painting, and when I did, I was a tiny figure in what seemed like an industrial forest, steam pipes blowing hot steam with a thunderous boom, big boilers standing tall like great oaks. The floor became vents, a dark forest of iron. However, in the distance, I could see what appeared to be someone else. Yes, that is definitely a person. I moved towards them, and it appears they do the same. They were hidden by the hot steam and darkness. Despite this, I trusted them on instinct alone. My good-hearted intentions were well-intentioned, but it did not seem they felt the same. Brandishing a knife, they slashed at me like a savage animal, making inhuman grunting sounds, at some points, squealing like a pig. I was in shock and tripped over myself. Was I gonna die? I didn't know. I didn't know where I was or why I was there. Nonetheless, this threat was very real. Were they on drugs? They kept coming at me mindlessly, piercing my trembling, soft flesh. It squelched and splashed, and I groaned in pain. I kicked them off of me, and in the minuscule amount of light, I saw my attacker's face. It was Colin. Suddenly, I was sent back to my kitchen. My stove was in flames, the smoke alarming blaring. What is happening? Despite my confusion, I put out the fire and put the kitchen's window down to let the smoke out. In the window's reflection, I saw something strange. Where I was stabbed, it was there, and it wasn't. It looked like I was fully healed, but still had a reminder of my stabbing. How? Whatever the case, I went back to bed. In our next session, Colin looked uneasy. However, he has yet to be screened for depression. So I wanted to check for that today. Thoughts of self-harm, suicide. Colin's hands are clasped. Uncomfortably, he rolls up his sleeves, showing his jagged scars. Well, I'm not an expert or anything. On? Colin stared at me like he analyzing something. On suicide, he answered. Colin shrugs his shoulders in a helpless gesture. I jot down some notes. How has your sleep been? Are you staying asleep or half and half? I'm a light sleeper. Some more notes. Do you dream or do you not remember if you do? Colin rested back in his chair. I do dream. A recurring one about a boiler room, large pipes and steam coming from every end. And a man is there with me. He's trying to kill me with this knife. Colin mimes the size of the knife, about this big, but I fend him off before he can do anything, and then the dream ends. I was surprised by Colin's answer. It's 1 for 1 with the weird dream I had last night. And this man, does he have any recognizable features? Is he someone you know or knew? I had a feeling Colin would say he saw me in his dream, but surprisingly, no. Colin said casually, no. I don't know this man. I have a strong feeling he was lying, but I will not force him to answer. It could just be a coincidence. There was a long pause. Our time was about to come to an end soon, but I had just one more question. What are you feeling in this dream? Colin didn't answer and just waited until he could leave. That night, I was in the kitchen again. There was something about the fire painting that wasn't there before that called to me. But that led me to the kitchen's flame, so I don't what I was trying to test. My eyes were transfixed at the top of the blue flames coming from the stove. I held out my hand to the fire like cupping the face of a child. My hand burnt, the flesh crisping. I was in pain, but I felt calm, collected even. Suddenly the telephone rang, ringing very loudly. I took my hand out of the fire, turned off the stove, and went to answer it. I picked the phone and put it to my ear. Hello? The sound of the caller's voice was very loud, speaking in different voices, changing from one to another. Some of the sounds were inhuman and mixed with growls and howls. A soft scream is heard, then quickly turns into a pained, choking scream. Suddenly the voice changes to a man's, quietly pleading, "Help! Leave me alone! Please, God, please, leave me alone!" I was confused and frightened by the call. "What do you want? I think you have the wrong number." A muffled voice could be heard. It became a woman's voice, crying, pleading with me for something I could not provide. "Listen, I can't do this. I'm going to hurt someone. I need help, please." "Who are you?" The woman begins to cry hoarsely. The voice becomes manly, harsh, and ugly. Horrified, Stop doing this to me." Gasping and snoring sounds are heard. Then the girl screams again. I was in a panic. What could I do? Who was I speaking to? Jesus Christ, who are you? I'm a therapist. I can help. Just tell me who you are. A man starts huffing, puffing in between breaths, then yells, "Listen, fucker, stop doing this to me. Sir, please calm down. What is happening where you're at? Are you in immediate danger?" The voice became low-pitched, manic, sloppy, slurring words. "You have to die. You have to die. Then faintly crying, "You won't stop. Please just stop. You have to die." "Who are you talking about, sir? Sir?" The line ended. The faint hum of a cut-off call ringed in my ear. I looked at the phone and then put it up. Fuck it. I'm going to bed. The ashes of the past crumbled in the wind, but from those ashes a new darkness would rise. I work abroad at a Japanese theme park. I've found where all the trapped kids are. For previous parts, watch our previous videos and subscribe also. Children, dozens of children, maybe hundreds. When I regained consciousness, that's the first thought that entered my mind. Jesus Christ, there's a lot of them down here. And by here, I mean some kind of underground amphitheater with nightmarish rows of seats. Each seat, a black cage of interlaced ribs, entrapping a motionless child who's had their eyes and mouths sealed with tight, shiny cables. It was probably the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. I myself was surrounded by the metal ribs as well, except that my tall, 25-year-old torso extended beyond the smaller cage designed for children. I had a few limbs sticking out, thank God. Judging by the uniformity of all the other cages, my guess is that I was placed via some automated process that had gone unchecked, which meant that the black cables that should have been sealing my face were instead wrapped around my chin. It was tempting to call for help, to yell and see if someone else would respond, but of course that might have been suicide. I didn't know where I was. Underground, maybe? I only knew that my supervisor, Usami-san, had paralyzed and sent me here. That bastard. I was stupid to tell him anything. I should have known he was part of the conspiracy among top brass at Bakery Park. They were all complicit in imprisoning the swathes of Japanese kids here. I remember my girlfriend Aiko said that only 3 children had gone missing at the theme park. How wrong we were. Those were clearly just the 3 the public knew about. I spent the first few minutes totally awestruck by the horror of it all. It was hard to believe I was staring at an inhumane prison designed exclusively for 6 to 12-year-olds. Cruelty incarnate. At the center of the amphitheater-like floor was a heap of LED panels undulating in a faint white glow, supplying light to the rest of the space. I watched patiently as one of the panels became bright pink and produced a hologram of a large cartoon pig with a cinnamon roll for a tail. It was Buchan. The light turned off, but the hologram remained, untethered to roam free. The pig squealed and spoke in aggressive Japanese. Ririsu Kapuseru 478-97742. Release capsule 478-97742. A child cage only a few rows down from me lifted into the air. Several spider-like legs emerged beneath it and skittered down to Buchan. The pig snorted and inspected the young boy. Yokata. Madajuku Shiterio. Suitakoi. Good, still ripe. Follow me. The arachnid cradle waddled behind the hologram pig as he marched down an exit. The sound of the spider feet scraping and stabbing the floor echoed outwards until fading away. Good Lord, what have I gotten myself into? With my free hand, I grabbed and twisted at each of the ribs holding my chest in place. The metal was strong and unrelenting, but then I discovered an external hook-shaped appendage, and when I pulled, the whole cage opened. I was free. Count your fucking blessings. Several pinprick sensations stung across my back as I stood up. On my seat, I could see several loosely hanging needles and tubes. IVs? I moved quickly, sliding between the rows of young victims, climbing over their cage casings sometimes. If I wanted to, I could have pulled the same hook appendage and freed several children as well. The thought weighed me down, a small anchor of guilt. But what good would that do? What if they cried out? What if I had to carry one? I had no clue where I was supposed to go. For all I knew, freeing a child might have been condemning them to something far, far worse. No, I was better off going alone, scoping it out. Rescue would have to be figured out later. When I descended past the last row and stepped the gray, cave-like floor, I could see exits in at least 5 different directions. They were all sealed by tight aperture doors, all except for the tunnel that Buchan entered. I took a deep breath. The LEDs pulsated rhythmically, casting my shadow against the rows of young kids. My silhouette stretched into a long, scrawny shape across the helpless forms, like a spindly tree, incapable of supporting anything. There was nothing for me here. I snuck down the tunnel. It was very hard to see in the pure, unassailable darkness. Clearly the tunnel was designed for beings who could emit their own glow. not for fleshy human escapees. I kept my fingers sliding along the right wall, marching forward and making sure I didn't trip over anything. Eventually, I did see a mix of glimmering lights at the end of the tunnel. They alternated between blue, yellow, and pink. It might have been Buchan or more like him, which sent chills down my spine, but I ignored the feeling and edged closer. Grime, soot, and I don't know what else clung to my fingers and clothes as I crawled along the wall. I was still wearing my Mr. New York outfit, which I'm sure was now streaked with God knows what. They might have taken my phone and keys, but at least they left me my costume. I used the chef's hat to wipe sweat from my eyes. The lights danced brightly as I neared the tunnel's exit. It gave the impression of some kind of nightclub or carnival. As I came even closer, I could see indeed it came from a shimmering neon sign. Photonics Bazada, Photonics Bazaar. What the hell? On my immediate right, I saw a space densely packed with cryopod-like chambers. Inside each chamber was the glowing hologram of a child, looking at me with tired, defeated eyes. There seemed to be no one else around at this bazaar. I went up and put my hand on the nearest chamber. The little girl on the other side placed her palm beneath mine. She was saying something frantically. I could see shimmering, translucent tears trickle down her shimmering, translucent face. I wish I knew how to lip read. I had so many questions. What did they do to you? I stepped away and looked at the sign, centered between all these glass chambers. Premium flavors, Chiba region, half price. I reread the text several times to make sure I translated correctly, but that's what the words said. This was a stall, a storefront, and as I looked deeper into the grand hall I just entered, I realized could see dozens of them, several storefronts each offering a different variant. Semnesh Nokomle, flavors of Yamanashi, Wamuna Tongjing Noe, authentic Tokyo taste. Senakomnoer, 50gawa flavors, 50% off. My bottom jaw had fallen somewhere along the floor. My hands clasped my head. What the fuck? Through the middle of this bizarre hall was a long, connected row of tables and chairs, like you might find at the center of any food court, except the furnishings here were clearly designed for beings much larger than humans. I approached the first table and spotted a single chrome bowl left on the edge. Inside I could see a shimmering mixture of pink and cyan. Pace quickened, I sped down the large, empty hall, trying to process what I was seeing. In between the flavor stalls were shops for all kinds of uncanny silver instruments. Spoons, bowls, knives, corkscrews, and other things I didn't want to look at. And every now and then I'd spot a black column supporting the ceiling. On each column were glowing digital numbers. They said 857 like any old alarm clock on Earth. In a few moments, they read 858. I slid my way beneath the long cafeteria table and kept a low profile, and I'm glad that I did, because when the clock hit 9, all hell broke loose. The ceiling became an LED explosion of sparks and lights, descending hordes of shimmering creatures down into the hall. But they weren't ravenous, bloodthirsty monsters like I was expecting. No, if I had to describe them, I'd say they behaved more like obsessive shoppers at a mall. I watched from the floor as a hologram monkey mascot, covered in donut sprinkles, prepared his shimmering pair of tote bags. There was a bipedal dog, with pancakes for ears, who ran over to some glass-chambered children for sale and started smelling each one. There was even a weasel, made of churros, who was giving out coupons for specific stalls. They were all animals infused with dessert elements, which meant they were likely characters designed at Bakery Park. But did that mean they were all harmless virtual mascots at one point? And somehow they now lived underground, enjoying humans as flavors? I want that fresh boiling from Kanagawa, the one with the glasses. I've heard these creamy types from Shimato are the best. How much? Where are the 4-star smart ones? I want a new pet, and then I want to eat him when I get bored. I could see their illuminated hooves, paws, and bird feet walk back and forth across the bazaar grounds. They were crowding around close to where I was hiding. Tongue clenched between my teeth. I stayed beneath the tables and skulked forward, putting my heels down before my toes, making as little noise as possible. With their attention on the merchandise, no one seemed to notice a lone human scuttling away between cafeteria benches. But I knew I wasn't safe for long. Once they all started eating, I'd be toast. I crawled from table to table, maintaining momentum until I heard a loud, familiar voice through a loudspeaker. Friends, old comrades and newly arrived, please gather round for our morning auction. I could practically hear the sharp teeth inflect on marshmallow lips. It was Mashimaro. A stampede of glowing claws, tails, and feet all gathered at one extension of the hall. I could see pushing among the attendees. Everyone wanted a spot. Today's auction item goes by the name Shigeru Tanaka. His family has worked at the Japanese embassy for generations. They also own and operate one of the largest contiguous farms in Hokkaido. To inhabit his body would be to experience wealth and luxury among the top 5th percentile of the surface world. Oohs and ahs arrived in unison. Shigeru has no siblings, which guarantees you will inherit much, if not all, of his family's exemplary estate and connections. For a vessel of this caliber, the bidding shall begin at 3,000 nodes. I looked ahead of me and noticed that the crowds of feet were thinning. Every Glimmer mascot was drawn to the auction. It quickly grew heated. I offer 4,000, 8, 12,000. 12,000's nodes from the fellow in the back. Mashimaro spoke with proud satisfaction. 12,000 going once, 12,000 going twice, 16. Seizing the opportunity, I crawled further away, only breathing when I needed to. Perhaps if I kept my head down, I would have found another exit to this bazaar. Perhaps if I kept my head down, I would have found an alcove to hide in, and learned much more about this place in general. But unfortunately, I did not keep my head down, not when I heard the screaming, the hysterical, ear-bursting screaming. It came from a kid. An intense empathy cut through my heart. A deep-rooted compassion that went beyond just the care for another human. It was like a mammalian instinct. A primal desire to save the young squeaking thing from an all-too-early death. I couldn't help but poke my head out from under the tables and look back. Sure enough, I could see a human boy, still in the flesh, dangling by his feet. It must have been the ripe one, plucked by Buchan not long ago. The living rib cradle had reformed into a hanging post that the kid could not escape. 44,000 nodi? Going once? Going twice? Gasps of astonishment bubbled through the crowd. Clearly such a bid had not been offered for some time. Sold. To Mamechi for 44,000. Well done, sir. For those who do not know, Mamechi is one of our oldest progenitors. He's been at this for a long time. You deserve to retire well, old friend. I could see Mashimaro shake hands with a particularly pixelated-looking hologram. Mamechi looked like he had lived inside an 8-bit game all his life. I will enjoy retiring as an 8-year-old affluent progeny. I will ensure our island stays safe. Unanimous cheers drowned out the small boy's cries. Mashimaro initiated a long mechanical lancet to descend from the ceiling. It resembled an oversized syringe. I watched helplessly as the needle entered the boy's neck and sucked the life from his eyes, quite literally, because the syringe chamber suddenly filled with a digital life form of the boy. His life essence had been removed and hologramized. All right, Mashimaro smiled. Brace yourself. An antenna was stuck into the center of Mamechi's pixelated body, absorbing him inside the metal instantly. Then, the needle still inside the boy's neck lit up like a flash of lightning, and suddenly the lifeless boy was awake again, complete with bright yellow eyes and a sinister grin. The possessed child was deposited back into a walking black cradle amidst a final round of applause. Thank you all for attending. Mashimaro hollered. Let us bid farewell to Mamechi as he enters the elevator. My attention was rapt. Elevator? The spidery cradle walked over to an indented circle on the floor. Puffs of dust shot out as the circle lifted by a foot. It was a platform. Above, I could see a correspondingly large circle open up on the ceiling. Little mandala patterns lit up around the perimeter. An elevator. Right here. Right now. Maybe it was my overconfident youth, or maybe it was because I had just been exposed to a new definition of hell. But I felt like I had to do it. I had to take a chance. My plan for stealth was all wishful thinking anyway, whereas this mad dash had a very real chance of escape. When the platform lifted 3 feet, I bolted out from under the table and broke into a sprint. By the time any of the hologram mascots noticed me, I was already within leaping distance. What is that? A human. What is it doing here? My jump could have been better timed. I maybe could have landed on the circle more cleanly, but I had grabbed hold of the edge. I was still on. Pulling for my life, I hoisted myself up onto the lifting platform. The only thing on board was the black, stationary cradle. Inside it was an 8-year kid who leered at me with menacing eyes and a frozen smile. James Naka, employee MERV 604373, is that you? I looked to my left and saw the hovering, bewildered face of Masumaro. He levitated alongside the platform as it raised. Did you forget I could float? The marshmallow tanuki snapped his fingers and the elevator stopped, but not until we were 3 stories above the ground. I had nowhere to run. Shit. What a surprise to see you here. I was saving your auction for the off-season. No one wants an ancient 25-year-old. Were you trying to save yourself the same embarrassment? I fell to my knees and begged, keeping my hands up high over my head. I didn't know what else to do. Please, I won't tell anyone about any of this. Just let me go. Won't tell anyone. Masumaro enjoyed wallowing in his own laughter. The same way you wouldn't tell anyone about where you found Kaito? He pointed at my wrist with the glowing stamp, Sin. It's seared in pain. The same way you agreed to work at the confection showroom? He slapped my floppy chef's hat off my head. It fell onto the crowds below. James, I like you. I really do. And I gave you many chances to play along, but it's too late now, my friend. The metallic arm holding the syringe descended from the ceiling again. I could hear it whirring behind my head. No. Please no. You've besmirched yourself, James, and this public display has likely voided your auction, if I'm being honest. I could hear Mamechi's spider cradle stand again. Its limbs clawed into my back, holding me in place. I held my hands together as tightly as I could. I closed my eyes. Please, just send me home. I spent an eternity waiting for an obliterating sting at my neck, or for Masumaro to zap me into dust. But nothing happened. Send you home, huh? Masumaro spoke pensively. You know, that might not be a bad idea. When I opened my eyes, I could see an antenna poking inside Mashumaro's body. He giggled, as if the metal prong could tickle his white belly. Let's try it. Let's send you back to America. I could feel a long, thin needle delicately enter my neck. What? Masumaro giggled some more as the antenna grew bright. Not alone, of course. The shock in my neck came with such force it felt like I'd been beheaded. I reached with my arms, but quickly lost all feeling. Before I knew what was happening, all I could see was white. Colorless white. I had gotten my wish. I was free. My vision was working again, and I could feel the ground beneath my back. I was in the confection showroom. But as I got up to stand, I realized none of the movements were made by me. My body moved and walked and breathed and swallowed, but I wasn't in control at all. Some version of Masumaro had taken over the executive functions of my brain. I watched pathetically through my own eyes as this photonic monster controlled every muscle I flexed and every word I said. Immediately on the surface, I met with the big brass at Bakery Park, Mr. Sadu and Kibian. They congratulated me on a job well done as a cast member and agreed I should be given administrative control of installing the Bakery Park franchise somewhere in the U.S. You've really proven yourself to us, Naka-san. You should be very proud. I left on the ferry the next day without saying goodbye to Nana Obasan and without ever reaching out or texting Aiko in any way. Aiko, if you're reading this, please DM me. I never wanted to leave you in the dust. Across several days, I watched Masumaro delete nearly all contacts from my phone and my social media. In less than a week, he had personally insulted every meaningful contact in Japan and America I knew, burning every friendship, relationship, acquaintanceship I ever had. All my connections were purged, save for my new managers at Bakery Park. It was fucking devastating. I was no longer a happy-go-lucky English teacher traveling the world to discover himself. I was an entrepreneur, loaded with seed money to start a theme park in America. Masumaro moved me to California, to a swanky apartment building in Los Angeles. To maintain an illusion of humanness, he even reached out to my mom and dad. Ironically, my parents loved the change. They said I was so driven now. They were amazed how I could afford to stay anywhere, and how I was so close with such successful businessmen in Japan. I wanted to scream at my folks, who, by the way, never got along with the old me. I wanted to tell them they were supporting the worst, most sociopathic version of myself. But of course I had no voice in the matter. I couldn't do anything. Every now and then, Mashumaro would march my body to a washroom and have it stare at itself. He would smile, and I could see the disturbing shimmer in his eyes. "What a good boy you've been," he'd say. "Kindness is never wasted." Sometimes I'd watch him converse with other new bodies, the term he uses for photonically controlled humans, and they would talk about how their operations were going in Japan. He even met with Kaito. Yes, the same Kaito that I rescued with Aiko at the start of all this. Even though Kaito was just a kid, he spoke with an old man voice and was already involved in his family's shipyard business. It was disgusting just how far the conspiracy went, and how many normal flesh and blood people were supporting the photonic agenda. Bakery Park's Sato-san, Kei-bin, and even my supervisor Usami-san were all just normal people, happy to upend their morals to keep their positions of power. Throughout Japan, I learned photonics were kidnapping about a dozen kids a day, which wasn't helping with Japan's population crisis. And in America, they were now starting to capture a dozen kids a week. And it was only going to get worse. Mashumaro had amassed a team of new bodies to buy some land in Anaheim. The U.S. Bakery Park is slated to be built sometime in the next 5 years. I had to endure every minute of every meeting, feel the sweat on every greasy handshake, taste the burn of every fruity vanilla cognac I would never drink. I had to watch myself become a soulless, corporate monster intent on ending humanity. Up until a few months ago, I thought my life was truly over. And then I discovered my only saving grace. Each night when Mashumaro finally went to bed, my old body would briefly disconnect from him. For a long time, there wasn't much I could do, because I couldn't control my old body either. But after a lot of effort focusing on my fingers and my toes, I was slowly able to reassert some control. Recently, I was able to start walking during Mashumaro's REM sleep. And only even more recently was I able to start writing on his laptop. Mashumaro so far has had no recollection of what I do during his rest. And I'd like to keep it that way. I've purposely limited myself to only an hour or two each night. I've stealthily shot emails to a few select people through an Outlook account I've managed to keep hidden. But so far, the responses have been fruitless. I've even created a secret WhatsApp to try and reconnect with friends who might help me. But they all think I've become a selfish, money-hungry shill. And so, over the last few days, I decided to type up my story, this story, and release it to the world. I figured if I started at the beginning and explained the whole situation, then someone new might finally help me. It's been nothing but dwindling hope and misery ever since Aiko and I saved Kaito from the confection showroom. A disaster of events. And you have every right to disbelieve me and think I'm crazy. Hell, I know I would. But if you're that person who has read my whole story, and you're willing to sneak massive packages into an address in LA without alerting Mashumaro, please DM me now. My goal is to get my life back. My goal is to unveil the grand photonic conspiracy to the world. My goal is to find out what happened to Aiko Agatsuma and save her if it's not too late. Please help. God bless.